I am Emma, 34 years old, and my younger sister hijacked my wedding venue exactly 3 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. She stood in my living room, flashed a brand new engagement ring, and laughed while telling me I could just find a public park for my ceremony because she needed the mountain estate for her influencer brand. My parents nodded along, ordering me to surrender my dream day to protect her fragile nerves. I did not scream or fight them. I simply packed my bags and handed over the vendor list. They thought they had bullied me into submission, as they always did. They celebrated their stolen victory right up until the morning of her wedding, when the estate manager handed her a formal eviction notice. She demanded to speak to the owner, entirely unaware that she was about to face the very sister she had tried to erase. Before I reveal how I legally dismantled my family and their golden illusion, tell me your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome to Orange Revenge. Hit that like button and subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people walk blindly into a trap they built themselves. The morning fog clung to the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a thick slate-gray mist burning off under the early North Carolina sun. It was Saturday, exactly 9 in the morning. I stood on a private terrace overlooking the rain-cleared valley. The air held the sharp, clean scent of damp pine needles. I wore an ivory silk wedding gown. The heavy fabric pooled around my feet, tracing a silhouette I had spent months having tailored for this exact day. I held my phone to my ear. The screen cast a faint, sterile glow against my cheek. "Yes," I said. My voice was quiet, a gentle murmur that barely carried over the mountain wind. "Cancel it. All of it. Now." I lowered the phone and tapped the red button to end the call. The screen went dark. For a long-held beat, I did not move. I simply closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the cold metal of the railing. There was no triumphant smirk. There was no cinematic exhale of victory. Instead, my chest hitched with a quiet, ragged breath that looked dangerously close to grief. The burden of what I had just set into motion settled over my shoulders, heavy and sharp. Resting on a small glass-topped patio table beside me was a framed architectural rendering. It depicted a stunning glass conservatory nestled deep within a forested valley, the walls transparent, reflecting a canopy of autumn leaves. I reached out my thumb, resting on the cold glass of the frame, a moment too long. I traced the architectural lines of a place I had envisioned as my sanctuary. My phone vibrated against the tabletop. The sudden metallic buzz shattered the mountain quiet. The screen lit up with a text message from my sister Harper. It contained a champagne glass icon and a ring icon followed by the words, "Best day of my life." I stared at the glowing pixels. A familiar ache flared in the back of my throat. It was the echo of a 9-year-old girl who had learned early on that her role was to surrender her space so her sister could shine. My jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath my skin. I read the message one more time, letting the casual, oblivious cruelty sink in. I was not enjoying this. I took no pleasure in the mechanism of ruin I had just deployed. But as I set the phone face down on the rendering shielding, Harper and her words from view, the grief in my eyes hardened into something entirely different. I turned away from the misty mountain view and looked back toward the open French doors of my suite, where the warm murmur of genuine friends and the clinking of coffee cups beckoned. I composed my face, burying the ache where it belonged. 72 hours earlier, the nightmare had officially begun. 72 hours earlier, the nightmare had officially begun on a humid Tuesday evening in Charlotte. The thick North Carolina heat pressed against the windshield of my unassuming sedan as I navigated the grueling rush-hour traffic heading toward the modest townhouse Carter and I rented. To my family, I was merely a mid-level risk analyst. I spent my days buried in spreadsheets, keeping my head down and drawing a very sensible, unimpressive salary. It was an illusion I maintained meticulously to avoid their constant scrutiny and endless demands for financial favors. I walked through my front door, carrying a stack of manila folders, slipping my keys into my coat pocket, expecting a quiet evening reviewing seating charts and finalizing our modest honeymoon itinerary. Instead, I found my sanctuary invaded. The heavy scent of my mother's signature floral perfume hit me the second I crossed the threshold. Victoria was sitting gracefully on my beige linen sofa, her posture rigid and perfect, holding a glass of iced tea that she had poured herself. My father William stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed over his chest, inspecting the crown molding of my living room with his usual thinly veiled disdain. He always looked at my home as if it were a temporary, unfortunate stepping stone rather than the life I had chosen. And pacing the center of the room was my younger sister, Harper. She was 30 years old, vibrating with a frantic, self-important energy, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The moment the front door clicked shut behind me, the three of them turned their heads in unison. There was no warm greeting. There was no polite inquiry about my workday. They looked at me with the unified, expectant gaze of a firing squad waiting for the command. Carter was already home. He sat at our small dining table, his laptop open in front of him. As a seasoned corporate litigator, he spent his days tearing hostile witnesses apart in high-stakes deposition rooms. But right now, his posture was tense, his dark eyes locked onto mine the moment I entered. He did not say a word, but the slight tightening of his jaw signaled that I was walking directly into an ambush. Emma finally. Harper sighed, tossing her phone onto the coffee table. She held up her left hand, fanning her fingers out to display a heavy, ostentatious diamond ring catching the fading evening light. Preston and I are engaged. I paused, setting my folders down on the entryway console. Preston was her latest obsession, a loud, flashy cryptocurrency investor who spoke entirely in buzzwords and treated every social interaction like a networking opportunity. They had been dating for barely 4 months. "Congratulations, Harper," I said, keeping my tone even and polite. "That is a very sudden development. It is sudden, but it is perfect." Victoria chimed in, setting her iced tea down with a sharp clink against the coaster. Preston is launching a major new digital asset portfolio this upcoming Monday. His investors require a certain projection of stability and success. A high society wedding this very weekend will provide the exact optics his venture firm needs to secure their funding rounds. I stared at my mother, trying to process the sheer logistical absurdity of her statement. "A high society wedding this weekend?" I repeated, my voice dropping. "Mom, my wedding is this weekend. We have guests flying into Asheville on Thursday. The rehearsal dinner is in 2 days." Harper stepped forward, closing the distance between us. A bright, chillingly oblivious smile plastered across her face. I know she said, her tone light and breezy, as if we were discussing swapping dessert options. "That is actually why we are here, Em. Preston needs a specific aesthetic for the launch photographs. He needs a sweeping cinematic backdrop. A courthouse ceremony simply will not work for his brand." So I reached out to the venue coordinator at the Cascade Glass Conservatory this morning. The air in my living room seemed to evaporate. The Cascade Glass Conservatory was my dream venue. I had spent 2 years securing the date, saving every spare dollar from my supposedly mediocre analyst salary to fund the breathtaking mountain estate. I told the coordinator we needed to make a sudden administrative change to the booking. Harper continued, waving her hand dismissively. I explained that we were keeping the exact same date and the exact same time slot, but we were just swapping the names on the primary contract. The manager was so accommodating. Preston wired over an expedition fee to smooth over the paperwork. So the mountain estate is officially mine now. My heart stopped. The sheer breathtaking entitlement of her words hung in the quiet space of my living room. She had not asked. She had not bargained. She had simply bypassed me entirely, bribing a venue coordinator to hijack a milestone I had meticulously built. "You can just find a backyard somewhere else." M. Harper laughed, adjusting the diamond on her finger. "You and Carter are so low maintenance anyway. Your guests will not mind a casual barbecue at Uncle David Place. I really need this aesthetic for my brand, and you know how important Preston investors are right now." I stood frozen near the entryway. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed armor I wore around my family cracked. A raw, authentic flash of profound hurt flickered across my face. It was the same familiar ache I had carried since childhood. I remembered being 17, saving my wages from a summer job for a reliable used car, only to have my parents drain my savings account to pay for Harper modeling portfolio because her dreams were deemed urgent. I remembered my college graduation dinner being abruptly canceled because Harper had experienced a minor breakup and required the entire family undivided emotional support. My worth in this family had always been measured by my willingness to shrink. My role was to serve as the invisible foundation upon which Harper could build her glittering, chaotic life. "You transferred my venue contract 3 days before my wedding," I whispered, the betrayal burning a hot, sharp path down my throat. "I have 200 guests arriving. I have florists and caterers expecting a glass conservatory. You cannot just steal my location." William stepped away from the fireplace, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the floor. "Do not use that word, Emma," my father commanded, his voice a low, warning rumble. "Nobody is stealing anything. We are reallocating family resources to address an immediate critical priority. Preston business launch dictates a strict timeline. You are a sensible girl. You understand practical logistics. It is not just about the logistics," Victoria interjected, standing up to join my father. She deployed her weaponized Southern charm, her voice taking on a sweet, suffocating cadence designed to smother any resistance. "You know your sister struggles with severe anxiety. Planning an entire wedding from scratch would absolutely destroy her fragile nerves. You are the strong one, Emma. You have always been the resilient daughter. Asking you to step aside and host a modest gathering is a small sacrifice to ensure your sister's emotional well-being." They were reciting the exact script they had used to control me for 3 decades. They were framing my subjugation as a compliment, wrapping their theft in the guise of sisterly duty. If I fought back, if I raised my voice and demanded my venue, I would instantly be branded the jealous, vindictive villain trying to sabotage my sister's happiness. They would spin the narrative painting my desperation as hysteria. I looked at Harper. She stood there radiating a smug, victorious energy waiting for me to break. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to throw a tantrum so she could cry to our parents and solidify her role as the delicate victim. I closed my eyes for one brief, agonizing moment. The child inside me, the girl who just wanted her parents to choose her for once, wept bitterly. The pain was real, a deep, hollow crater in my chest. I opened my eyes and looked past the 3 invaders standing in my living room. I looked at Carter sitting quietly at the dining table. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the wood. As a litigator, his instinct was to rise from that chair, quote contract law, and tear my family apart using raw legal intimidation. But he did not move. He knew my history. He knew that if he fought this battle for me, I would remain trapped in their cycle forever. He waited for my signal, his dark eyes offering a steady, grounding anchor in the storm. He slowly reached his hand under the table, holding it out. I took a few steps forward and slipped my trembling fingers into his palm. He squeezed my hand, a silent, powerful surge of solidarity. I turned my attention back to my parents and my sister. I swallowed the burning lump of grief in my throat. I pushed the hurt down into the dark, locked vault of my mind. I did not argue. I did not point out the sheer cruelty of their actions. I did not tell them that a backyard barbecue was an insulting replacement for a mountain estate. I let my shoulders drop slightly, adopting the posture of a woman who had been thoroughly and decisively defeated. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, flat and compliant. "I understand." Harper's face lit up with greedy triumph. Victoria let out a dramatic sigh of relief, praising my maturity, while William nodded in stern approval, satisfied that the natural order of the household had been restored. They turned their backs to me, immediately discussing floral arrangements and catering menus, already erasing my presence from the room. They thought they had won. They thought I had folded, submitting to their demands, exactly as I always had. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that my quiet surrender was not a white flag. It was the careful, deliberate setting of a steel trap. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a harsh neon green in the dark kitchen. 2 in the morning. A steady North Carolina rain tapped against the single-pane window of the modest apartment, blurring the streetlights into smeared pools of yellow. I sat alone at the scratched laminate dining table, staring at the swirling surface of a cold cup of chamomile tea. The heavy silence of the night offered no comfort. It only provided a blank canvas for the memories I had spent years trying to suppress. I traced the rim of the ceramic mug with a trembling finger. The hollow ache in my chest was not a new sensation. It was an old, familiar companion, a phantom limb that throbbed whenever the people who were supposed to love me decided I was taking up too much space. The theft of my wedding venue was not an isolated incident. It was simply the latest withdrawal in a lifelong campaign of emotional and financial liquidation. My entire existence within that family had been defined by my utility to Harper. I was not a daughter. I was a resource to be harvested whenever her glittering, chaotic life required additional fuel. My mind drifted backward, pulled into the undertow of a humid July afternoon when I was 17 years old. I had spent 12 grueling months working early morning shifts at a local bakery, hoarding every spare dollar into a joint savings account. I was trying to pay for a prestigious summer economics program at a university in Atlanta. It was my ticket out, a chance to build a foundation for my future. I remembered standing at the bank teller window holding my acceptance letter, ready to request the cashier check. The teller had looked at her screen, frowned, and informed me the account balance was zero. I remembered running home, my lungs burning, only to find my mother packing designer outfits into a pristine suitcase. Victoria had not offered a shred of guilt. She simply sighed, adjusting her pearl earrings, and told me that Harper had secured a callback with a boutique modeling agency in New York. The agency required an expensive portfolio, travel accommodations, and coaching fees. My father had defended the theft with clinical detachment. He told me I was naturally smart and could easily apply for scholarships next year, but Harper possessed a fleeting window of opportunity that could not be missed. They drained my hard-earned savings to fund a photo shoot that ultimately led nowhere, leaving me to spend that summer wiping down bakery counters while Harper posted pictures from Times Square. The memories cascaded, stacking upon one another, until the weight felt suffocating. I closed my eyes, and I was 22 years old again, standing on the sun-baked brick sidewalks of Chapel Hill. I had just graduated summa cum laude. I wore the heavy black gown holding the leather-bound diploma that represented countless sleepless nights and relentless academic discipline. I had made a reservation at a beautiful steakhouse months in advance to celebrate the milestone. But as the commencement crowds thinned out, my parents hurriedly packed their vehicle. Harper was turning 21 that same weekend. She had thrown a tantrum about sharing the spotlight and demanded an impromptu luxury weekend in Charleston to celebrate her birthday. My parents canceled my graduation dinner without a second thought. I stood on the curb, clutching my diploma, watching their taillights disappear down the highway. I walked back to my empty dormitory, ordered cheap takeout, and ate it sitting on the floor. That was the exact day the pattern solidified in my mind. My achievements were invisible. My joy was an inconvenience. My sole purpose was to shrink so that Harper could expand. A soft rustle of fabric broke through the storm of my thoughts. Carter stepped into the dim kitchen. He wore a pair of gray sweatpants and a plain cotton shirt, his dark hair tousled from sleep. He did not turn on the overhead lights. He understood the sanctity of the dark. He walked over to the dining table and pulled out the chair opposite mine. He sat down, folding his large hands together, resting his forearms on the worn laminate surface. As a corporate litigator, he was trained to read the microscopic shifts in human behavior. He could dissect a hostile witness with a single glance, and right now his intense analytical gaze was focused entirely on me. We sat in the quiet shadows for a long time. The rhythm of the rain hitting the glass filled the space between us. I kept my eyes fixed on my tea, terrified that if I looked directly at him, the fragile dam holding back my grief would shatter. "You are too quiet," Emma Carter said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, carrying a profound tenderness that contrasted sharply with the aggressive nature of his profession. I watched you hand over the vendor lists to the very people who just bulldozed your wedding. I watched you smile and nod while they treated you like a disposable stepping stone. I swallowed hard, fighting the tightness in my throat. It was the easiest way to get them out of our home, I whispered, keeping my gaze lowered. If I fought them, the argument would have lasted for hours. Carter tilted his head, leaning forward to close the physical distance between us. "That is an excuse," he replied gently. "If a stranger walked into this apartment and stole something from you, you would not hesitate to call the police. If an executive tried to hijack one of your firm acquisitions, you would tie them up in litigation for the next decade. You are a brilliant, formidable woman. Yet when your parents and your sister walk into the room, you fold yourself into a tiny box and hand them the tape. Why are you not angry?" The question hung in the humid air, piercing straight through my defensive armor. Why was I not angry? The truth was a bitter, jagged pill to swallow. I slowly lifted my head and met his gaze. His dark eyes offered a safe harbor, a space devoid of judgment or manipulation. Because anger is what they feed on. I said, my voice trembling slightly, before finding its steady, chilling rhythm. If I yell, if I cry, if I demand basic respect, I instantly become the villain in their narrative. They want me to throw a tantrum. They want me to scream about the stolen venue so they can point their fingers and call me jealous, hysterical, and bitter. My anger gives them the ammunition they need to justify their cruelty. It proves to them that Harper is the sweet, fragile victim, and I am the cold, ungrateful tyrant. I took a shaky breath, pressing my palms flat against the table. I learned a long time ago that the only way to survive my family is to starve them. If I do not care, they cannot hurt me. If I agree with their absurd demands, they lose their leverage. I make myself invisible. I make myself small. If I want nothing, they have nothing to take away from me. This was my fundamental lie. It was the toxic, self-destructive coping mechanism I had crafted over 3 decades to navigate the emotional minefield of my childhood. I genuinely believed that disappearing was the only valid form of self-preservation. I had convinced myself that surrendering my joy was the price of maintaining peace. I thought my stoic silence was a shield completely oblivious to the fact that it was actually a cage. Carter reached across the table, his warm hands covering my trembling fingers. He did not offer a patronizing smile or a hollow platitude. He looked at me with a fierce, protective sorrow, recognizing the profound depth of the wound I was trying so desperately to hide. He saw the brilliant woman who built corporate empires during the day, reducing herself to a frightened child in the middle of the night, just to avoid conflict with people who did not value her. "They have trained you to believe that standing up for yourself is an act of aggression," Carter murmured, his thumb tracing the knuckles of my hand. "They convinced you that your presence is a burden. But starving them of a reaction does not keep you safe, Emma. It just teaches them that they can take whatever they want without facing a single consequence. You are not protecting your peace. You are just funding their delusion." The truth in his words struck me with the force of a physical blow. A single tear escaped my eyelashes, tracing a hot path down my cheek before dropping onto the wooden table. I did not want to be invisible anymore. I did not want to shrink. I looked at the dark window, listening to the rain, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of a lifetime spent in the shadows. The grief of knowing my family would never choose me settled deep into my bones, a cold and permanent reality. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, drawing a slow, stabilizing breath. I had surrendered the venue. I had played the role of the compliant, defeated daughter flawlessly. My parents and Harper were currently sleeping soundly in their upscale homes, basking in the glow of their stolen victory, entirely convinced that my quiet submission was the end of the story. They believed I was still the powerless 17-year-old girl standing in a bakery or the 22-year-old sitting alone in a dorm room. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the dark. The following morning required a performance worthy of a seasoned stage actor. The Carolina sun beat down on the sprawling flagstone patio of my parents' estate in Myers Park, casting long, elegant shadows through the manicured oak trees. I sat across from my mother and sister at a wrought iron garden table, a pitcher of sweet tea sweating in the center. The air tasted of humidity and blooming magnolia, a cloying sweetness that masked the transactional rot beneath the surface of our family dynamic. I placed a sleek, slate-gray binder onto the glass tabletop. Inside those covers rested 2 years of meticulous planning. It held the finalized contracts for the heirloom rose installations, the deposit receipts for the Appalachian String Quartet, and the customized menu from a highly sought-after local chef who specialized in elevated Southern cuisine. It was the blueprint for a flawless mountain celebration, all funded by the quiet, relentless hours I spent analyzing corporate buyout structures. Harper snatched the binder before I could even slide it fully across the table. Her eyes darted over the tabbed dividers, her manicured fingers tracing the high-end vendor names with a greedy, unearned satisfaction. She did not say thank you. She simply pulled out her phone to verify the login credentials for the caterer online portal. Victoria leaned forward, resting her cool, ring-adorned hand over my wrist. Her smile was a masterclass in soft, maternal gaslighting. It was the kind of smile designed to make a person feel cherished while they were being quietly dismantled. "You are showing such remarkable maturity today, Emma," my mother murmured, her tone dripping with a soothing melodic cadence. "I know surrendering your vision is a sacrifice, but you have always been the sensible one. Harper possesses a different kind of spirit. She is sensitive. She needs the perfect environment to thrive, especially with Preston's influential network watching her every move. You stepping aside like this just proves what a strong, practical woman you have become. A lavish party was never really your style anyway." I looked into her eyes, observing the flawless rationalization of her theft. She was actively rewarding my submission, praising my willingness to be erased. I offered a placid, docile nod, retreating behind the familiar mask of the compliant daughter. My father stepped onto the patio, holding a ceramic coffee mug and a folded financial newspaper. He surveyed the scene, taking in the gray binder resting in Harper's grasp. He offered a curt, approving nod in my direction. The gesture felt heavy, a patriarchal stamp validating the hierarchy of his household. "Family protects family," William stated, his voice a gravelly baritone that brokered no debate. "You made the right call, Emma. Your sister requires this specific launchpad to secure her future with Preston. You are doing your duty to elevate the family name. We will make it up to you eventually." I did not point out the hollowness of his promise. I did not mention the restricted trust fund they had unlawfully drained to secure Harper's fraudulent hold on my venue. I simply kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, radiating a serene, unbothered acceptance. "Hey guys," Harper chirped, lifting her phone high into the air. The camera lens glared down at us, capturing her radiant manufactured joy. She tossed her blonde hair over her shoulder, ensuring the morning light caught the heavy diamond resting on her left hand. "Major wedding update," Harper announced to her unseen digital audience, her voice pitching into an artificial, breathless excitement. "I am so incredibly grateful for my supportive family today. Sometimes the universe just aligns." We secured the most breathtaking mountain estate for our ceremony this weekend. A huge shout-out to my amazing sister for stepping aside and handing over her spot so Preston and I could have our dream day. Remember to surround yourself with people who sacrifice for your happiness. I sat quietly in the background of her video, a blurry, compliant prop utilized to enhance her narrative of unearned triumph. I offered the camera a brief, tight-lipped smile. They truly believed they had stripped me down to the studs. They thought they had drained my joy, commandeered my resources, and relegated me to the shadows. An hour later, Carter and I packed our luggage into the trunk of our SUV. The drive away from Charlotte felt like a deliberate exile. We navigated the congested lanes of Interstate 40, leaving the towering glass headquarters of the financial district behind. As we drove westward, the elevation climbed, and the sprawling Piedmont Plateau gave way to the dense, towering ridges of the Appalachian Mountains. The silence inside the vehicle was dense, but it carried no tension. Carter kept his eyes on the winding highway, his hand resting comfortably on my knee. We were supposedly retreating to a modest rented cabin tucked deep in the woods, banished from our own celebration so that my mere presence would not cast a shadow over Harper's spectacular weekend. I slouched in the passenger seat, letting my shoulders drop, physically adopting the posture of a woman who had been thoroughly defeated. I stared blankly out the window, watching the blur of pine trees and granite rock faces pass by. The illusion of my retreat had to be flawless. I had to inhabit the role of the wounded, discarded sibling until the very last second. We arrived at the cabin by late afternoon. It was a rustic A-frame structure surrounded by towering hemlocks, smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. It was quiet, isolated, and entirely disconnected from the glittering society event gathering momentum a few miles down the mountain. I stepped out onto the wooden back deck, sinking into a weathered Adirondack chair. The cool mountain air bit through my thin sweater. I pulled my phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. I opened a web browser, typing in search queries for public park pavilions, community centers, and cheap municipal event spaces. I scrolled through the dreary, fluorescent-lit images of linoleum floors and plastic folding chairs. I scrolled through available dates, projecting the image of a heartbroken bride desperately trying to salvage a ruined weekend. Then a subtle notification banner dropped down from the top edge of my screen. It was a sterile automated alert from my encrypted corporate email server. Subject R.E. Blue Ridge. Closing docks, spring. I stared at the black text, hovering over the image of a grim municipal park pavilion. The email referenced a massive multi-million-dollar hospitality acquisition my private equity firm had finalized months ago. The message carried the weight of a loaded weapon sitting quietly in my inbox, holding the keys to the entire mountain range. I did not open the email. I did not smile. I placed my thumb against the screen and swiped the notification away without a single glance. It vanished into the digital background, a dormant mechanism waiting for the precise moment to deploy. The sliding glass door behind me scraped along its metal track. Carter stepped out onto the wooden deck, carrying 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He handed one to me, the ceramic warm against my chilled palms. He leaned his hip against the wooden railing, looking down at my illuminated phone screen, noting the dreary venue listings I was pretending to evaluate. The mountain breeze ruffled his dark hair. He studied my face, his sharp litigator instincts searching for any sign of hesitation, any lingering flicker of the girl who used to shrink to survive. He knew the devastating legal consequences of the trap we were currently building. He knew that once the snare snapped shut, the collateral damage to my family's social and financial standing would be permanent. "You are sure about this?" Carter asked. His voice was quiet, a low, steady rumble blending with the rustle of the pine needles. I turned off my phone, the screen fading to black. I looked out over the vast, darkening expanse of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The child who once cried over stolen savings accounts was silent. The woman who remained was steady, grounded, and entirely resolved. I have been sure for 6 months I answered my tone, even and unyielding. Carter took a slow sip of his coffee, his dark eyes fixed on the tree line. The phrase sounded like quiet resignation, the tired sigh of a woman accepting her inevitable defeat. It was anything but. The following morning brought a tense, artificial calm to the rented cabin. The air inside felt thick, charged with the unacknowledged reality of what was about to unfold. I dressed in a simple, understated beige trench coat and flat boots, maintaining the visual narrative of a woman who had quietly accepted her diminished status. Carter drove us down the winding mountain roads toward the Cascade Glass Conservatory, ostensibly to handle the final administrative humiliation of collecting my refunded deposit. The estate was a sprawling 500-acre masterpiece of Appalachian architecture. A winding driveway lined with towering centuries-old oaks led to the main conservatory, a breathtaking structure of iron and glass nestled flawlessly into the rugged mountain landscape. It was the kind of venue that commanded astronomical fees and a 2-year waiting list. As we pulled into the gravel parking lot, I spotted Preston matte black luxury sport utility vehicle parked aggressively across 2 reserved spaces near the front entrance. The arrogant crypto investor had already arrived to claim his stolen territory. We walked through the heavy carved wooden doors of the main administrative lodge. The reception area was an elegant blend of rustic stone and polished leather, smelling faintly of expensive wood polish and fresh mountain air. Harper was already holding court in the center of the room. She stood over a massive drafting table, dramatically gesturing at a set of blueprints alongside Preston. Her voice, shrill and commanding, echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings. She was rapidly firing off demands to a team of frazzled event planners, actively tearing apart the delicate, understated design I had spent months finalizing. "I want the entire southern wall draped in imported white orchids," Harper dictated, slapping a manicured hand against the blueprint. "And the lighting needs a complete overhaul. I need an immersive cinematic glow for the influencer reel. Double the audiovisual budget. I do not care what the upcharge is. We secured the best venue in the state overnight, and I am not holding back." Preston leaned against the drafting table, checking the notifications on his smartphone with practiced boredom. He wore a sharp, custom-fitted suit that looked entirely out of place in the rustic mountain setting. He glanced up as Carter and I walked into the room, his eyes scanning Carter, plain button-down shirt and dark denim jeans with an expression of thinly veiled contempt. Preston derived his entire sense of self-worth from volatile digital markets and flashy networking events. He viewed traditional stable professions as the refuge of the unimaginative. "Hey, man!" Preston called out, his voice loud enough to interrupt Harper demands. He offered Carter a patronizing, pitying smile. "Sorry about the venue mix-up, but you know how the market works. Agility wins the day. You guys will find a nice little spot for a courthouse thing, I am sure. Must be tough grinding away in a boring law job while the real wealth is moving at the speed of light." Carter stopped walking. The corporate litigator, a man who routinely dismantled fraudulent executives and stripped them of their multi-million-dollar assets during brutal courtroom cross-examinations, did not flinch. He did not defend his career or explain the lethal power he wielded in the financial district. He simply looked at the flashy, over-leveraged crypto bro leaning against the table. Carter offered a slow, incredibly serene smile. "You are absolutely right, Preston," Carter replied, his deep voice carrying a smooth, effortless calm. "I deal in very rigid binding contracts. It can be quite boring. But the beauty of the law is that it always catches up. Enjoy the agility while it lasts." Preston scoffed, completely missing the razor-sharp warning hidden beneath Carter's polite tone. He turned his attention back to his phone, dismissing us entirely. I walked past them, heading straight for the closed oak door of the general manager office. I did not knock. I simply turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The office was plush and heavily paneled, featuring a massive mahogany desk facing a large window overlooking the glass conservatory. Sitting behind the desk was Marcus, the senior venue coordinator. Marcus was a seasoned hospitality veteran, known for his impeccable composure and his ability to handle demanding high-net-worth clients without breaking a sweat. But the moment I crossed the threshold, his professional facade fractured. Marcus physically jolted in his leather executive chair. The color drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen pale. He did not offer a polite, sympathetic greeting to a bride who had just lost her dream wedding. Instead, he scrambled to his feet, his hands fluttering nervously over the scattered contracts on his desk. "Ms. Johnson," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he hastily buttoned his suit jacket. He rushed around the side of the mahogany desk, closing the distance between us, his posture radiating a bizarre, desperate deference. "I did not expect you to arrive in person. Please have a seat. Can I get you anything, water, coffee?" I remained standing near the doorway, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. The air in the office was thick with his sudden, suffocating panic. "I am just here for the administrative paperwork, Marcus," I said smoothly. "I need to finalize the cancellation and collect the deposit check. My sister is currently in the lobby signing the updated contracts for her event this weekend." Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly. He looked terrified, far more terrified than a simple venue coordinator should be when facing a displaced client. He reached back and grabbed a manila folder from his desk with trembling fingers. "Of course, Ms. Johnson," he murmured, holding the folder out to me with both hands, treating the paperwork as if it were a fragile explosive device. "The refund has been expedited. The cashier check is inside. I cannot express how deeply, deeply sorry I am for this sudden transition. We strive for excellence here, and this entire situation is highly irregular." I took the folder, feeling the thick, high-quality paper beneath my fingertips. He was apologizing profusely, his eyes darting frantically to the closed door, terrified that Harper or Preston might walk in. He was sweating, a fine sheen of moisture coating his forehead, despite the cool, climate-controlled air of the office. Harper remained oblivious in the lobby, loudly confirming a $150,000 upgrade for her staging and floral arrangements. She was authorizing massive non-refundable charges, entirely convinced that her sudden infusion of stolen trust fund cash had bought her absolute control over the estate. She thought the manager deference was a product of her newfound wealth. She had no idea the terror in his eyes was reserved exclusively for me. I opened the manila folder briefly, verifying the cashier check tucked inside the pocket. The numbers matched the initial deposit I had paid over a year ago. I closed the folder and looked back up at Marcus. He was staring at me, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot, waiting for the axe to fall. He knew he had bent the rules. He knew he had accepted a quiet, illicit expedition fee from Preston to bypass the standard cancellation protocols and transfer my lucrative date to another client. He thought he was dealing with a naive, powerless woman who would simply accept the loss and walk away. I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice so the sound would not carry beyond the thick oak door. I did not scream. I did not threaten his job or demand an explanation for his corrupt behavior. I simply looked into his panicked eyes and asked a single, highly specific question. The words barely disturbed the quiet air of the office, but their impact was instantaneous. Marcus froze. His breath hitched audibly in his throat. He stared at me, the terrifying realization of his catastrophic miscalculation finally settling over him. He slowly, deliberately nodded his head once. The movement was rigid, a silent confirmation of the inevitable destruction approaching his doorstep. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, turning away from him and reaching for the brass door handle. "Ensure the staging crews have full access to the conservatory today. Let them build exactly what she requested." I stepped back out into the bustling reception area. Harper was finalizing a signature on a thick stack of vendor agreements, her diamond ring flashing under the rustic chandelier. She did not even look up as Carter and I walked past the drafting table and exited through the heavy front doors. We walked across the gravel parking lot in silence. The mountain air felt crisp and clean, washing away the cloying scent of my sister-manufactured Triumph. I slipped into the passenger seat of our SUV, tossing the manila folder onto the dashboard. Carter started the engine, the powerful motor humming quietly. He looked over at me, noting the chilling, absolute calm settling over my features. He shifted the vehicle into gear, pulling away from the breathtaking glass conservatory I had just quietly surrendered. The trap was now fully armed, locked, and hidden in plain sight. The perpetrators were currently standing inside, happily paying for the very explosive that would soon level their entire world. We drove down the winding mountain road, leaving them behind to bask in the fragile temporary illusion of their stolen victory. The drive back to the cabin was wrapped in a thick silence. The tires of the SUV hissed against the wet asphalt of the mountain road. I watched the dense canopy of pine trees blur past the passenger window. My breathing was steady. The trap was laid. But as I glanced over at Carter, I noticed a distinct shift in his demeanor. The calm, supportive posture he had maintained inside the venue coordinator office had vanished. His jaw was locked tight. His dark eyes scanned the winding road with a sharp, calculating intensity. He was not celebrating. He was dissecting a problem. We arrived at the rustic A-frame cabin just as the late afternoon sky turned a bruised shade of violet. Carter cut the engine but did not immediately reach for the door handle. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the dark leather. "We need to talk about the exposure," Carter said. His voice was a low, measured rumble that instantly shifted the atmosphere inside the vehicle from victorious to perilous. I turned to face him, the leather seat creaking softly. "What exposure? I own the property. Marcus breached his employment agreement by accepting a side payment to alter a confirmed booking. I am fully within my rights to terminate his contract and void the fraudulent reservation." Carter unbuckled his seatbelt and turned his body toward me. "You are looking at this like a private equity partner evaluating a clean asset, Emma. You are treating it like a sterile transaction. But I am a litigator, and I look at how this plays out in front of a civil judge. What your family did was incredibly ugly. Preston handing Marcus cash to expedite a date transfer is sleazy. But proving criminal commercial bribery beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law is a very high bar." I frowned, the crisp mountain air suddenly feeling stifling. "I have the power to evict them." "You have the authority." Carter corrected his tone, sharpening with legal realism. "But if you wait until the morning of the wedding to exercise that authority, you create a massive liability window. Harper and Preston have already signed a venue agreement. They are currently pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into non-refundable upgrades, staging, and floral installations. If you drop the hammer on Saturday morning and lock them out, Preston will not just walk away. He will hire the most vicious civil attorneys in Charlotte by Monday afternoon." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over me. "They will file an emergency injunction. They will sue your holding company for tortious interference, breach of the implied covenant of good faith, and severe emotional distress. Preston crypto money will fund an endless discovery process. They will drag your private equity firm into the public eye. And worse, your parents will go straight to the local media." The chilling reality of his assessment began to fracture the icy resolve I had built all afternoon. Carter leaned closer, his dark eyes searching mine. "Think about the narrative they will spin, Emma. They will not tell the press they stole your venue. They will say the wealthy, bitter older sister set a premeditated trap to publicly humiliate the fragile younger bride. They will frame you as a vindictive tyrant who waited until the last possible second to destroy a family celebration out of pure jealousy. You will be cast as the undisputed villain. A judge might actually look at your delayed enforcement of the property rights as a malicious act of retaliation." A cold, profound dread bloomed in the center of my chest. The armor I had worn for the past 3 days cracked, letting the freezing wind of doubt seep into my bones. Carter was right. The legal system did not always reward the righteous. Often it protected the loudest, most well-funded victim. If I executed my plan, my family would twist the truth, weaponize the legal system against my firm, and cement my status as the monster they always claimed I was. We stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the quiet, dimly lit cabin. The scent of wood smoke from the cold fireplace offered no comfort. I dropped my trench coat onto a wooden chair and began to pace the length of the living room. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots. For 34 years, my primary survival tactic had been evasion. I had built a successful career by meticulously anticipating risk and avoiding exposure. Now, standing in the shadows of the cabin, the overwhelming urge to retreat surged through my veins. The thought of a grueling, publicized legal battle with my own parents made my stomach turn. I could picture my mother weeping in a deposition room, performing her tragic victim routine for a sympathetic judge, while my professional reputation was dragged through the mud. I stopped pacing and looked at Carter. He stood near the kitchen counter, watching me wrestle with the rising tide of panic. "Maybe we just walk away," I whispered. My voice sounded brittle, stripped of the corporate authority I usually commanded. "We can drive down to the Asheville City Hall tomorrow morning. We can sign the marriage license, have a quiet lunch, and drive back to Charlotte. We let them have the glass conservatory. We let them have the floral arrangements and the string quartet." I wrapped my arms around my waist, a defensive posture I had perfected during my childhood. If I pull the trigger on this eviction, I become the exact person they always accused me of being. I become the cruel, unyielding sister who crushes people. If we just go to the courthouse, it is clean. It is quiet. I disappear from their narrative entirely, and we avoid the lawsuit. It is easier. It was the ultimate temptation. The allure of the dark night of the soul. The siren song of my oldest, most destructive lie. The belief that if I just made myself small enough, if I wanted nothing, I would finally be safe from their chaos. Carter walked across the room, his footsteps steady and deliberate. He stopped right in front of me, reaching out to gently grasp my shoulders. He did not shake me. He did not raise his voice or demand that I fight. His touch was a grounding anchor in the middle of a swirling storm. He looked down at me, his gaze piercing straight through the frightened 9-year-old girl and finding the brilliant woman hiding beneath. "You have spent your entire life absorbing their collateral damage," Carter said softly. "Every time they took something from you, you rationalized it. You stepped back into the shadows so they could stand in the light. But retreating to a courthouse tomorrow is not finding peace, Emma. It is surrendering your dignity." I closed my eyes, a single silent tear slipping down my cheek. I do not want to be a monster, Carter. I do not want to burn my family to the ground just to prove a point. Carter shifted his hands, lifting my chin, so I had to look directly into his eyes. "You do not have to burn them," he said, articulating every word with sharp, profound clarity. "You just have to stop protecting them from themselves." The sentence hung in the quiet cabin, a quiet revelation that struck me like a bolt of lightning. You just have to stop protecting them from themselves. Carter dropped his hands and stepped back, letting the truth of his statement take root. "You do not need to manufacture a retaliatory strike," he explained, shifting back into the sharp analytical litigator. "We just need to remove the emotional retaliation from the equation. If we evict them simply because you are angry, they have grounds for a lawsuit. But if we evict them because their presence on the property constitutes an active, verifiable financial crime against a corporate entity, they have zero legal standing to fight back. We do not strike out of spite. We strike using undeniable, documented fraud." I stared at the cold fireplace, my mind racing as the heavy fog of self-doubt burned away. Carter was offering me a path that did not require me to become a villain. He was offering a strategy based entirely on accountability. To execute a flawless, legally sound eviction, I needed more than just a breached venue contract. I needed proof that Harper and Preston had funded their stolen wedding using illicit means. I needed to prove that my parents were not just overbearing relatives, but active participants in a financial crime that exposed my holding company to severe liability. I needed the financial records. I needed the restricted family trust. The fear that had paralyzed me moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing focus. The little girl who wanted to disappear was gone. The senior private equity partner had returned to the table. I walked over to my leather tote bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I set the computer on the rustic dining table and flipped the screen open. The pale blue light illuminated the dark room. I looked up at Carter, a resolute, dangerous calm settling over my features. "We are not going to the courthouse," I stated, "and I am not going to protect them anymore." Carter smiled, pulling out the chair beside me. "Let us review the trust ledgers." The real work was about to begin. The ambient glow of the laptop screen cast sharp shadows across the rustic wooden table. The cabin remained completely silent, save for the rhythmic tapping of my fingers against the keyboard. Carter sat beside me, his presence a steady anchor as I navigated through a labyrinth of encrypted financial portals. I was not accessing my primary corporate accounts or the aggressive private equity portfolios that fueled my career. I was logging into a highly secure, heavily isolated banking interface. Carter leaned closer, his brow furrowing as he analyzed the routing architecture appearing on the screen. He was a master of corporate litigation, accustomed to unspooling complex offshore holding companies. But the account I was currently unlocking did not resemble the aggressive financial vehicles I typically managed. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Emma Carter," asked, his tone shifting into clinical focus. "You mentioned the family trust, but your parents have always operated their own modest retirement portfolios. If they bribed the venue coordinator and paid for these massive, non-refundable staging upgrades, they must have liquidated a significant personal asset. Or Preston fronted the entire bill." I shook my head. my eyes fixed on the spinning authentication circle. Preston did not pay for the structural upgrades, I replied smoothly. Preston is an arrogant crypto investor who relies heavily on leveraging volatile digital assets. He uses margin accounts to project liquidity, but his actual cash reserves are notoriously fragile. He would never dump a massive amount of unrecoverable cash into a mountain estate venue. He expects the bride family to finance the heavy lifting to maintain their Southern high society facade. The authentication protocol cleared, and the dashboard of the private trust loaded onto the screen. The header read, Johnson Heritage Trust. Carter studied the title, clearly perplexed. I have never seen this account in our disclosures. You never mentioned a heritage trust. Because it is not an active investment vehicle, I explained, keeping my voice incredibly measured. 2 years ago, right after my private equity firm secured our first major multi-million-dollar buyout, my parents began heavily pressuring me for financial access. They constantly hinted about a shared family portfolio, complaining about the rising costs of their country club memberships, and Harper's seemingly endless career transitions. They wanted a safety net, and they fully expected me to weave it for them. I paused, tracing the edge of the laptop casing. I did not want to set up an allowance. I did not want to become their automated teller machine. But the pressure was relentless. So I established this specific trust account. I deposited exactly $200,000 into it. I structured it so that my parents, William and Victoria, were legally listed as authorized signers with direct access to the funds. Carter frowned, a sharp litigator instinct flaring immediately. You gave them unfettered access to $200,000 in liquid cash. That contradicts every single wealth preservation strategy you have ever implemented. I know, I said quietly. But there was a highly specific condition attached to the trust. I sat my parents down in my office and explicitly informed them of the parameter. I told them this money was not a slush fund. I told them it was a sacred, untouchable reserve specifically earmarked for my future children. I declared it as the foundational education and health fund for the grandchildren they always claimed they wanted. I looked away from the screen, staring out the dark window toward the invisible mountain ridge. I made it abundantly clear that withdrawing funds from this specific account for any personal expenses, any luxury purchases, or any immediate family emergencies was strictly prohibited. It was an ironclad moral boundary. I told them the money only existed for the next generation. Carter leaned back in his wooden chair, processing the psychological weight of the maneuver. It was a test, he murmured, his voice softening with sudden, profound understanding. Yes, I confessed the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. It was never actually about the money, Carter. $200,000 is a rounding error in my corporate portfolio. I set up the trust because I desperately needed an answer. For my entire life, they had justified taking my time, my achievements, and my peace by claiming it was necessary for the immediate survival of the family. I needed to know if I provided a boundary marked specifically for my unborn children, a boundary wrapped in the very concept of family legacy they worshipped, if they would finally, for once in their lives, choose not to take from me. I wanted to know if a line existed that they would not cross to satisfy Harper demands. I prayed they would pass the test. I prayed that the account would sit untouched, gathering quiet interest, proving that beneath their toxic enabling, they possessed a shred of fundamental respect for my future. I dragged my gaze back to the glowing monitor. I hovered the cursor over the transaction history tab. My heart beat a slow, agonizing rhythm. This was the moment the illusion would finally shatter or miraculously hold firm. I clicked the button. The transaction ledger populated the screen. The columns were stark black text against a white background, delivering the truth with brutal, undeniable efficiency. The current available balance of the Johnson Heritage Trust read exactly $0.00. The silence in the cabin became absolute. The rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the glass seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the deafening roar of the financial data staring back at me. I reviewed the ledger line by line. The withdrawals had not occurred over months of slow bleeding. The entire $200,000 had been systematically drained over the past 72 hours. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the exact afternoon Harper had proudly announced her hijacked wedding plans in my living room. The destination routing numbers were glaringly obvious. Massive wire transfers had been executed directly to the Cascade Glass Conservatory, catering vendors, the luxury floral designers, and the premier audiovisual staging companies Harper had bragged about hiring. My parents had not hesitated. The moment Harper demanded an extravagant, influencer-ready mountain aesthetic, William and Victoria had logged into the sacred trust, completely disregarded the explicit moral boundary regarding my future children, and authorized the liquidation of the entire fund. They had stolen my unborn children education fund to pay for Harper White orchids and cinematic lighting. I did not scream. I did not throw the laptop against the wall. The reaction that settled over me was far more devastating than rage. It was a profound, suffocating grief. I reached out and gently closed the laptop. The screen snapped shut, plunging the dining table back into the dim shadows of the cabin. I kept my hands resting flat on the smooth aluminum casing, my head bowed. They took it. I whispered the words barely escaping my throat. They took every single dollar. Carter did not offer a hollow platitude. He did not immediately pivot to legal strategy or discuss the federal implications of the unauthorized wire transfers. He understood that this specific moment was not about building a legal case. It was about mourning the final, undeniable death of a desperate hope. He stood up from his chair, walked around the small wooden table, and wrapped his arms securely around my shoulders. He pressed his face against my hair, holding me in a silent, fiercely protective embrace. I let out a single ragged breath. The tears I had rigidly suppressed for days finally slipped free. They were not tears of anger over a stolen wedding venue or a hijacked weekend. They were the bitter, heavy tears of a daughter who finally accepted that her parents were fundamentally incapable of prioritizing her existence over her sister vanity. They had failed the test. They had chosen their golden child over my future, erasing my boundaries with breathtaking casual cruelty. The realization was a heavy terminal diagnosis. The family I had spent 34 years trying to appease was officially gone. Carter held me until the quiet wave of grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, steady clarity. The mourning period was necessary, but it was brief. The pain of their failure was the final catalyst required to fully sever the emotional chains that had bound me to their toxic narrative. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and slowly straightened my posture. The vulnerability vanished, locked away behind the impenetrable armor of a senior private equity partner. I opened the laptop once again, the bright screen illuminating the sharp, focused resolve returning to my eyes. My parents thought they had simply executed a clever financial maneuver to secure a beautiful party for their favorite daughter. They believed they had circumvented my boundaries without consequence. They had absolutely no idea that by draining a restricted trust to pay for non-refundable vendor contracts on a property they did not legally occupy, they had just elevated a domestic dispute into a massive, multi-layered commercial liability. They had handed me the exact undeniable proof of financial exploitation required to execute a flawless eviction. The trap was no longer a retaliatory strike. It was a legally mandated corporate defense. The grief was gone. The execution was ready to begin. The pristine air of the Blue Ridge Mountains carried the sharp scent of impending rain as the clock inside the bridal suite of the Cascade Glass Conservatory struck 8:47 in the morning. The sprawling sunlit room hummed with the frantic, highly caffeinated energy of an elite wedding preparation. Harper sat in the center of the room, perched on a tufted velvet chair, a silk robe draped perfectly over her shoulders. 3 makeup artists buzzed around her, meticulously applying a flawless, camera-ready contour. Her smartphone was mounted on an expensive ring light directly in front of her, actively live-streaming the chaotic luxury to her thousands of eager followers. Harper held a crystal flute of imported champagne, tilting her head to catch the natural light bouncing off her heavy diamond engagement ring. She laughed loudly, broadcasting a narrative of effortless, unbothered triumph. She was the glowing, victorious bride, reveling in a stolen kingdom, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality hurtling toward her door. Two heavy knocks echoed through the suite, cutting sharply through the energetic playlist pulsing from a portable speaker. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, revealing Marcus, the senior venue coordinator. He did not step into the room with the usual polished, accommodating smile expected of a high-end hospitality manager on the morning of a massive event. His face was a sickly, ashen gray. He looked like a man walking directly to his own execution. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a thick, sealed ivory envelope. "Excuse me, Ms. Johnson," Marcus murmured, his voice tight and barely carrying over the upbeat music. He did not address the lively room. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floor, actively avoiding Harper, expectant, slightly annoyed gaze. "I apologize for the interruption, but I was instructed to deliver this document to you immediately. You must read it before any further guests arrive on the property." Harper frowned, waving a manicured hand to shoo away a stylist attempting to pin her blonde hair. She took a slow, theatrical sip of her champagne, leaning back into her velvet chair to project an image of supreme annoyance. "Marcus, honestly, can this not wait?" Harper sighed, gesturing toward the glowing ring light recording her every move. "We are literally in the middle of a bridal broadcast. Preston investors are watching this stream. If this is about the updated seating chart for the VIP tables or the extra floral deposit, just give it to my mother. Victoria is handling the minor administrative details today." Marcus did not retreat. He did not offer the envelope to Victoria, who was currently sipping coffee near the bay window. He took one deliberate step closer to Harper, extending the sealed ivory envelope directly toward her. "I am terribly sorry, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a bleak, hollow register that finally caused the ambient chatter in the suite to die down entirely. "I cannot give this to your mother. The instructions were highly specific. He demanded that you receive this personally." Harper snatched the envelope from his trembling fingers, her annoyance escalating into sharp, bristling indignation. The heavy ivory paper bore no return address, just her name printed in stark, uncompromising black ink. She shot a bewildered look at her mother, who merely shrugged, stepping closer to observe the disruption. "Who is he?" Harper demanded, turning her glare back to the pale venue coordinator. "Is Preston trying to send me some kind of dramatic groom gift before the ceremony? Because this is a terrible delivery method for a romantic surprise." Marcus slowly backed away toward the heavy mahogany doors, desperate to put physical distance between himself and the impending explosion. "It is not from the groom, ma'am," Marcus whispered, grabbing the brass door handle. "It is from the ownership. And again, I am so deeply sorry." The door clicked shut behind him, sealing Harper inside the suddenly quiet suite. She stared at the thick envelope, a flicker of genuine confusion, finally breaking through her manufactured influencer facade. She slid a manicured fingernail under the flap, tearing the heavy paper open. She extracted a single crisp legal document featuring the embossed seal of a corporate holding company. Harper scanned the bold text printed across the top of the page. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers. The delicate crystal hit the hardwood floor, shattering instantly, sending a spray of expensive alcohol across the hem of her silk robe. She did not even flinch. Her eyes widened into terrified, uncomprehending saucers as her brain struggled to process the devastating legal terminology staring back at her. "What is it, Harper?" Victoria asked, her voice tight with sudden maternal alarm, rushing forward to peer over her daughter's shoulder. "It is a cancellation notice." Harper gasped, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She looked wildly around the room as if expecting the walls of the bridal suite to dissolve. "It says my venue contract is entirely void. It says the booking was secured through unauthorized channels and the event is immediately terminated. They are ordering us to vacate the premises." Victoria snatched the document from Harper, her eyes scanning the paragraphs with frantic disbelief. "This is impossible!" Victoria shrieked, the elegant country club matriarch instantly transforming into a panicked, defensive animal. "We paid the deposits. We wired the money directly to Marcus. The florists are outside setting up right now. They cannot cancel a high society wedding 3 hours before the ceremony. This is a massive breach of contract. I am going to sue this venue into the ground." William burst into the bridal suite, drawn by the sound of his wife escalating screams. He wore his custom-tailored tuxedo trousers and a crisp white shirt, the picture of an affluent patriarch ready to command a room. He demanded to know what was causing the hysterical outburst. When Victoria thrust the cancellation notice into his chest, his face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. "Where is that incompetent manager?" William roared, crumpling the legal document in his massive fist. "I paid him a premium expedition fee to secure this date. I will have his job. I will destroy his career before lunch." Harper scrambled out of her velvet chair, completely ignoring the stunned makeup artists and the still recording ring light. She threw a heavy trench coat over her silk robe and stormed out of the bridal suite, flanked by her equally furious parents. They marched down the grand marble hallway of the mountain estate like a conquering army demanding to speak to the sovereign. They found Marcus standing nervously outside the main executive office, flanked by two imposing security guards wearing dark, unmarked suits. The guards did not look like standard event staff. They possessed the rigid, hyper-vigilant posture of former military contractors, their arms crossed firmly over their chests, projecting an aura of absolute, unyielding containment. Marcus Harper screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted stone ceilings of the corridor. "What is the meaning of this piece of garbage? You took our money. You signed the transfer agreement. You told us the venue was ours." Marcus did not apologize this time. The presence of the security guard seemed to fortify his fragile resolve. He stood up straighter, looking at the furious family with a mixture of pity and resignation. "I did sign the transfer agreement," Harper Marcus stated, his tone flat and heavily defeated. "I accepted the expedition fee from Preston. But I never possessed the legal authority to execute that transfer. I bypassed the corporate oversight protocols because you assured me it was a simple internal family adjustment. You lied to me, and more importantly, you lied to the holding company." William stepped aggressively forward, invading Marcus' personal space. His chest puffed out with arrogant intimidation. "I do not care about your internal corporate protocols," William bellowed. "We signed a contract. We paid the premium. I demand to speak to the owner of this estate right now. I will buy this entire mountain if I have to, but my daughter is getting married in that glass conservatory today." Marcus let out a slow, heavy sigh, stepping safely behind the perimeter established by the two security guards. "The estate changed hands 6 months ago," William Marcus explained, his voice devoid of any customer service warmth. "It was acquired by a massive private equity firm. The property operates under a blind trust called Blue Ridge Hospitality. The true owner does not negotiate with unauthorized trespassers. I do not care what the holding company is called." Victoria shrieked, her face flushed with frantic desperation. "Get the owner on the phone immediately. Tell them we will double the venue fee. Tell them we are prominent figures in Charlotte society. They cannot treat us like common criminals." "The owner is not on the phone," Victoria Marcus replied, gesturing toward the heavy oak doors of the executive office. "The owner is already on the property. They arrived early this morning to personally oversee the termination of your event. They are waiting for you inside." The toxic trio froze, their arrogant bluster momentarily derailed by the shocking revelation. The elusive, faceless corporate entity that owned the 500-acre mountain estate was sitting just a few feet away, holding the absolute power to ruin or salvage their massive social media spectacle. William straightened his posture, running a hand through his silver hair, instantly shifting back into the role of the persuasive, commanding executive. He believed he could walk into any room and dominate the negotiations simply through sheer force of will and financial intimidation. He nodded to Victoria and Harper, signaling them to follow his lead. He reached out and aggressively pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive office. The room was vast, lined with towering bookshelves and featuring a massive panoramic window framing the misty Appalachian peaks. The air inside was freezing, climate-controlled to an exacting, uncomfortable temperature. Sitting directly in the center of the room, positioned behind a sprawling mahogany desk, was the owner. Harper stopped dead in her tracks, her expensive designer trench coat slipping off her shoulder. William's jaw dropped, the commanding executive facade completely pulverizing into dust. Victoria let out a choked, breathless gasp, raising a trembling hand to cover her mouth. They had marched into the executive suite fully expecting to face a ruthless, unknown corporate titan. They expected an older, intimidating billionaire they could flatter, bribe, or legally threaten into compliance. Instead, they found me. I sat perfectly still behind the heavy mahogany desk. I was not wearing the casual, defeated sweaters I wore in my modest, rented apartment. I wore a razor-sharp, tailored ivory power suit. My hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek twist. I exuded the cold, lethal authority of a senior private equity partner who had just finished auditing a hostile takeover. I looked at my stunned, paralyzed family, resting my hands neatly on the polished wood surface. I offered them a slow, terrifyingly serene smile. The silence in the room was absolute suffocating and exquisitely beautiful. "Good morning, Harper," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the freezing air, slicing right through their fractured reality. "I hear you are having some issues with your venue reservation today. Please take a seat. Let us discuss the terms of your eviction." The silence hanging in the executive office was so dense, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the mahogany desk. My parents and my sister remained perfectly paralyzed in the threshold, their brains violently short-circuiting as they tried to process the impossible image in front of them. The docile, compliant daughter they had bullied and sidelined for 34 years had vanished entirely. In her place sat the apex predator of the Blue Ridge Mountains, wrapped in an ivory suit and wielding absolute corporate authority. Emma Victoria finally whispered, her voice cracking, as the sheer magnitude of her miscalculation began to dawn on her. "What are you doing sitting behind that desk? This is a private corporate office." I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward or display a single ounce of the frantic, hysterical anger they were so accustomed to provoking in others. I maintained my cold, unyielding posture, projecting the immense, quiet power of a woman who held the deed to the ground they were standing on. "I am sitting here because it belongs to me, Mother," I replied, my tone smooth and dangerously calm. 6 months ago, my private equity firm executed a massive hospitality buyout. Blue Ridge Hospitality Trust is a heavily obfuscated holding company. I am the managing partner. I acquired this entire 500-acre estate. When you bribed Marcus to transfer my wedding date, you did not steal a reservation from a helpless bride. You actively trespassed on a multi-million-dollar corporate asset that I personally own. William's face flushed a violent, mottled red. The arrogant patriarch who had spent decades lecturing me about the importance of family loyalty while treating my career like a pathetic hobby suddenly realized he was standing in a room built entirely by my success. His ego instantly kicked into overdrive, desperate to reclaim control of a narrative that was rapidly disintegrating. "This is an absurd, vindictive stunt," Emma William roared, stepping forward and slamming his hands flat against the edge of my desk. "You bought a wedding venue just to humiliate your sister. You orchestrated this entire ridiculous charade to publicly embarrass us on the morning of her ceremony. You are a deeply disturbed, jealous woman. I will call my attorneys right now. I will drag this holding company into civil court and bury you in litigation for breach of contract." I looked at my father, absorbing the full force of his furious delusion. He genuinely believed my primary motivation was petty sibling jealousy. He thought I spent millions of dollars just to win a meaningless family argument. He was entirely blind to the true depth of the betrayal that had brought us to this exact moment. I slowly opened the leather portfolio resting in front of me. I extracted a single crisp financial document and slid it across the polished wood, stopping it precisely in front of William's trembling hands. "This is not about the venue, Dad," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, devastating register that instantly silenced his blustering threats. "And this is certainly not about a petty sibling rivalry. I am not trying to humiliate you. I am simply holding up a mirror." William looked down at the paper. Victoria crowded in beside him, her eyes scanning the bold black text printed across the top of the page. It was the official banking ledger for the Johnson Heritage Trust. The final column, highlighted in stark, undeniable red ink, displayed the current available balance. $0. The blood drained completely from my mother's face. Her manicured hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sharp, terrified gasp. Harper, standing a few feet behind them, craned her neck to see the document, her confusion rapidly morphing into profound panic. "You didn't just steal my venue," I continued, ensuring every word landed with the precision of a surgical strike. "You emptied the restricted trust fund. I sat you both down in my living room 2 years ago. I explicitly established a clear, unbreakable moral boundary. I told you that money was a sacred reserve earmarked entirely for the education and health of my future children. It was the only thing I ever asked you to protect." Victoria stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of a heavy leather guest chair. She dropped into it, her pristine country club facade crumbling into a desperate, pathetic mess. "Emma, please," Victoria stammered, tears welling in her eyes as she attempted to deploy her usual maternal gaslighting tactics. "You have to understand the pressure we were under. Preston investors were expecting a massive, opulent event. Harper was on the verge of a total breakdown. We were going to replace the funds. We swear to you, we were going to pay it back after the wedding." "I know you were," I replied, my voice steady, though a profound, inescapable grief laced the edges of my words. "That is the part that truly breaks my heart, Mom. I know you always meant to pay it back, but you always meant to pay it back after you took it." The room fell dead silent. The truth hung in the freezing air, heavy and irrefutable. I looked at my parents, realizing the tragedy was not that they were malicious criminals trying to ruin my life. The tragedy was far more mundane and far more agonizing. They were simply people who fundamentally believed that my boundaries, my future, and my children were completely expendable if Harper's immediate desires required funding. They did not hate me. They just did not value my existence enough to protect it. I set up that trust as a test. I confess the raw honesty of the admission, stripping away the corporate armor for just a fraction of a second. I desperately needed to know if there was a single line you would refuse to cross. I prayed you would pass. I prayed that account would sit untouched, proving that beneath the favoritism and the endless demands you possessed a shred of fundamental respect for my life. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, locking eyes with my father. But the moment Harper threw a tantrum about needing a cinematic backdrop for her social media launch, you logged into that account, liquidated my unborn children's future, and wired the cash to floral designers and audiovisual staging crews. You sacrificed my family to fund a party. William swallowed hard, the aggressive, domineering posture completely deflating. He looked at the bank statement, his eyes darting frantically across the empty ledger. He was a man who prided himself on his unwavering moral compass, his prominent position in their affluent community. Sitting in this office, confronted with the undeniable documented proof of his own profound moral failure, broke him entirely. He could not blame this on my jealousy. He could not spin this as a simple misunderstanding. He had stolen from his own future grandchildren to appease the vanity of his golden daughter. The realization crushed the breath right out of his lungs. "So what happens now?" Harper asked, her voice trembling as she clutched the lapels of her designer trench coat. Her arrogant influencer persona had vanished, replaced by the terrified little girl who finally realized there were consequences for her actions. "Are you going to call the police? Are you going to have Mom and Dad arrested for wire fraud?" I looked at my sister, feeling an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. The prospect of dragging my family through a lengthy publicized federal trial, watching them sit in a courtroom while prosecutors dismantled their lives, offered absolutely no satisfaction. Retribution born of the legal system felt hollow. No Harper. I stated my tone, returning to a cold, definitive baseline. I am not pressing criminal charges. I am not calling the federal authorities, and I am not sending our parents to prison. Victoria let out a loud, ragged sob of relief, burying her face in her hands. William slumped against the edge of the mahogany desk, a massive shudder running through his frame. They believed they had dodged the bullet. They thought my mercy meant a return to the status quo, a familiar cycle of forgiveness and eventual compliance. They were catastrophically wrong. I am not pressing charges because a federal indictment is entirely unnecessary. I continued standing up slowly from my chair. A prison sentence implies a debt that can eventually be repaid to society. But what you took from me cannot be repaid. You did not just steal money, you destroyed the fundamental trust required to maintain a relationship. I picked up the manila folder containing the eviction notice and walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet away from my stunned family. I am not punishing you, I explained, looking directly at my mother. I am simply done shielding you from the consequences of who you actually are. I have spent my entire life shrinking my existence, modifying my behavior, and absorbing your collateral damage just to keep the peace. I thought my silence was protecting our family. I realize now it was only protecting your delusion. I handed the eviction notice directly to William. He took it with shaking hands, staring at the bold black text ordering his immediate departure from the property. Your event is canceled because you do not have a valid contract with this venue, I stated, operating strictly within the parameters of commercial law. The vendors you hired using my stolen trust fund are currently dismantling their equipment outside. The security team waiting in the corridor will escort you back to the bridal suite to collect your personal belongings. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the estate before you are formally charged with criminal trespassing. Harper let out a high-pitched, hysterical wail. She dropped to her knees on the expensive Persian rug, the glamorous wedding she had spent weeks bragging about evaporating into thin air. "You cannot do this to me!" Harper screamed, tears ruining her flawless camera-ready makeup. "My guests are already arriving at their hotels. Preston investors are expecting a massive gala tonight. I will be a laughingstock. My entire brand will be completely destroyed." I looked down at her, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had dictated my life for 3 decades was entirely gone. "That sounds like a terrible crisis, Harper," I replied smoothly, echoing the exact phrase she had used in my living room 3 days ago. "I suggest you find a backyard somewhere. I hear Uncle David Place has a very nice aesthetic." The absolute reality of the eviction notice settled over the executive office, heavy and suffocating. The frantic, aggressive bluster my parents had carried into the room completely vanished, replaced by the hollow, terrified silence of individuals who had finally reached the edge of a cliff they built themselves. The heavy oak door behind them creaked open. Preston stood in the threshold. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his hair slicked back with expensive pomade. He had clearly been waiting in the hallway, listening to the catastrophic implosion of his impending nuptials. Preston did not rush into the room to comfort his weeping bride. The arrogant crypto investor, a man who built his entire fragile fortune on projecting an image of relentless, unbroken success, assessed the scene with the cold, calculating detachment of a day trader watching a stock plummet to zero. He looked at the tears ruining Harper makeup. He looked at the trembling hands of his future father-in-law holding a legally binding eviction notice. Finally, his sharp gaze landed on the financial ledger detailing the stolen trust fund money resting on my mahogany desk. Preston was incredibly vain, but he was not stupid. He understood the lethal combination of public humiliation and federal financial fraud. Preston Harper gasped, pushing herself up from the Persian rug. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, her voice cracking with desperate, pathetic hope. "Please tell them we are not leaving. Call your lawyers. We can fight this. We have to save the wedding today." Preston did not step forward to take her hand. He remained firmly planted in the doorway, physically maintaining his distance from the epicenter of the blast zone. He slowly shook his head, his face a mask of profound, unvarnished disgust. "Fight what Harper?" Preston asked, his voice entirely devoid of the charismatic warmth he usually deployed for his social media audience. "You lied to me. You told me your family was heavily invested in prime Charlotte real estate. You implied your parents had the liquid capital to seamlessly execute a $250,000 event." He gestured vaguely toward the window, indicating the sprawling 500-acre mountain estate. I brought my primary seed investors here today because you assured me we secured an exclusive elite venue. Instead, I find out my future in-laws are secretly draining restricted trust funds to pay for floral arches, and the property owner is actively throwing you out for trespassing." Harper blinked, her chest heaving, as the brutal reality of his words struck her. "Preston, please," she begged, taking a hesitant step toward him. "We can fix the optics. We can spin the narrative for your investors. I will tell them the venue had a catastrophic electrical failure. We can move the reception to a luxury hotel downtown. We just need to leave right now." "I am not going anywhere with you," Preston stated smoothly, adjusting his expensive silk bow tie. "My entire brand is built on projecting absolute impenetrable financial stability. I cannot afford to be publicly associated with a family that commits wire fraud to finance a party. The optics of this disaster are completely unsalvageable. If I walk down that aisle today, my investors will pull their capital before the reception even begins." He looked at Harper, not with anger, but with the chilling transactional dismissal of a man liquidating a toxic asset. "I am cutting my losses," Preston announced, turning his back on the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 3 hours. "Tell your parents to keep the engagement ring. Consider it a consulting fee for the reputational damage I'm about to suffer trying to explain this mess to my board of directors." Preston did not wait for a response. He walked down the grand marble hallway, his dress shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards, abandoning his bride without a single backward glance. His desertion was clean brutal and entirely believable. He was a creature driven entirely by image, and Harper had just become a massive, undeniable liability. Harper watched him disappear around the corner, her arms still outstretched. She did not scream. She did not throw herself onto the floor and wail in the theatrical, exaggerated manner she usually employed to manipulate our parents. The sudden absolute quiet that settled over her was far more disturbing than any tantrum. My parents stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, entirely incapable of processing the rapid, catastrophic disintegration of their golden child future. William lowered the eviction notice, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. Victoria covered her face with her trembling hands, quietly weeping as the social standing she valued above her own daughter's sanity evaporated into thin air. Harper slowly lowered her hand, letting it fall limply against the silk fabric of her designer robe. She turned her head, her gaze drifting away from the empty hallway and locking directly onto me. I braced myself, expecting a vicious barrage of insults. I expected her to blame me for Preston's departure, to scream that my selfish, vindictive actions had ruined her entire life. I stood tall behind the desk, my posture rigid, fully prepared to weather the storm of her narcissistic rage. But the storm never came. Harper stared at me, her eyes stripped of the arrogant influencer persona she had worn for years. The heavy dramatic makeup could not hide the profound, aching exhaustion etched into her features. She looked incredibly small, a frightened, hollow shell of a woman standing in the wreckage of a life built entirely on illusions. "You were always the one who could do anything," Emma Harper said. Her voice was not a shriek. It was a fragile, barely audible whisper that seemed to echo in the cavernous executive office. I remained perfectly still, the unexpected vulnerability in her tone catching me entirely off guard. "You built this massive company." Harper continued, her gaze drifting around the opulent room, taking in the towering bookshelves and the breathtaking mountain view. "You moved to the city, you bought your own apartment, and you never needed them. You never needed anyone to bail you out or fix your mistakes. You were just so effortlessly strong." She swallowed hard, a single genuine tear slipping down her cheek, cutting a track through her foundation. It was the first authentic emotion I had seen from her in over 2 decades. "I couldn't stand being your sister." Harper confessed the raw, unvarnished truth, finally breaking through the heavy silence. "Every time I looked at you, I saw everything I wasn't. I wasn't smart enough to build a career. I wasn't brave enough to leave Charlotte. So I just took things from you. I took the attention, the money, the praise, because it was the only way I knew how to feel important. If I could make you smaller, it made me feel like I was finally big enough." The confession hung in the freezing climate-controlled air, a jagged broken piece of glass resting on the mahogany desk between us. It was not an apology. It was not a request for forgiveness. It was simply the absolute devastating truth spoken aloud for the very first time in our lives. A sharp, unexpected pang of grief twisted deep in my chest. The impenetrable armor I had worn all morning flickered. I looked at the sister who had tormented me, the woman who had stolen my joy and hijacked my wedding, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, I felt the ghost of a deeply buried love. I remembered the little girl who used to hold my hand during thunderstorms before the toxic dynamic of our household pitted us against each other. The tragedy was immense. She had spent her entire life trying to destroy me, completely unaware that I would have gladly helped her build her own foundation if she had only asked. My success was never meant to be a weapon against her, but her profound insecurity had turned it into a battlefield. I felt the old love flicker a warm, persistent ache, reminding me that despite the horrific betrayal, she was still my sister. But the grief of that realization was accompanied by a harsh, undeniable reality. Understanding her pain did not erase the damage she had inflicted. Acknowledging her deep-seated insecurity did not magically replace the stolen trust fund money, nor did it excuse the malicious theft of my wedding venue. Her confession explained the mechanism of her cruelty, but it did not absolve her of the consequences. The victory I had secured this morning did not feel triumphant. It did not carry the exhilarating rush of a successful corporate acquisition. It felt heavy, somber, and deeply tragic. The satisfaction of exposing their fraud was entirely eclipsed by the heartbreaking reality that my family was fundamentally broken beyond repair. I looked at Harper, seeing the genuine pain in her eyes, and I offered the only truth I had left. "I never wanted you to feel small, Harper," I said softly, my voice carrying across the quiet room. "But I am not going to spend the rest of my life shrinking myself so you can feel tall." I stepped away from the desk, moving toward the heavy oak doors. The emotional confrontation was complete. The truth had finally been spoken, dragging the toxic secrets out of the shadows and into the harsh light of day. But the practical reality of the eviction still loomed over the estate. My security team was waiting in the corridor. The catering vendors needed to be redirected. The fragile piece of the mountain venue had to be restored before my own guests began arriving for the legitimate ceremony. The emotional fallout was a tragedy I would have to process later in the quiet safety of my own home. Right now, I had a property to secure. The fragile, tragic silence that followed Harper's confession was violently shattered by the sudden, aggressive movement of our father. William could not tolerate the raw vulnerability settling over the room. For 3 decades, his authority within the family had been absolute, built on a foundation of unearned respect and fierce patriarchal control. He dictated the narrative, managed the optics, and punished any dissent. Now standing in an office he did not own, holding a legally binding eviction notice, and watching his golden daughter crumble under the weight of her own insecurity, his fragile ego entirely fractured. He could not accept that the quiet, compliant daughter he had dismissed as a boring analyst was actually the apex predator controlling his fate. To accept that reality was to admit his own profound failure. "You think this is over, Emma?" William snarled, his voice a harsh, grating rumble that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He took a heavy, intimidating step toward the mahogany desk, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. "You think you can just flash a corporate deed, kick us out into the street, and walk away clean?" I did not step backward. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, watching him desperately try to inflate his presence. "I will destroy you," he threatened, jabbing a thick finger in my direction. "You want to play high-stakes corporate games? Fine. I will call my attorneys right now. I will drag this holding company through civil court until you are bleeding legal fees. I will go to the local press and tell them exactly how the ruthless private equity partner deliberately ambushed her own sister on her wedding day. I will ruin your professional reputation. No investor in Charlotte will ever trust you with their capital again once I am finished exposing your vindictive behavior." Victoria, recovering a fraction of her country club composure, stepped up beside him, nodding vigorously. Her tear-stained face hardened into a familiar manipulative scowl. "We will make sure everyone knows what you did today," Victoria hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "We will tell the entire family. We will tell your colleagues. You will be entirely isolated. You will have absolutely no one left." The threat hung in the freezing air, a heavy, suffocating blanket of impending social ruin. In the past, this exact tactic would have paralyzed me. The terrifying prospect of public humiliation, of being branded the difficult, unstable villain in their meticulously crafted narrative, would have forced me into immediate submission. The old Emma, the terrified girl who just wanted to keep the peace, would have desperately backpedaled. I would have offered compromises, apologized for causing a scene, and quietly absorbed their abuse to protect the fragile illusion of family harmony. I would have made myself invisible to survive their wrath. But as I looked at my parents standing shoulder to shoulder in their desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain control, the old instinct simply did not materialize. The lie I had carried for 34 years, the belief that my safety depended on my invisibility, evaporated completely. I did not need to shrink to survive them. I was already untouchable. I looked at William, letting a cold, serene clarity settle over my features. I did not raise my voice to match his furious volume. I did not hurl insults or engage in the toxic mudslinging they desperately wanted. I simply stood my ground, projecting the immense quiet power of a woman who fully understood her own leverage. "You cannot ruin me, Dad," I stated softly, my words slicing cleanly through his aggressive bluster. "You do not possess the capital, the legal standing, or the social credibility to damage my career." William scoffed, his chest puffing out, but the nervous flicker in his eyes betrayed his mounting panic. He knew deep down that he was bluffing. "If you attempt to file a frivolous civil suit against Blue Ridge Hospitality Trust," I explained, articulating every syllable with deliberate precision, "my corporate litigators will immediately file a countersuit for the unauthorized liquidation of a restricted family trust. We will enter the bank statements into the public record. We will submit the wire transfer logs proving you committed grand larceny to fund a party." The color drained from Victoria's face once again. She grabbed William's arm, her manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Your country club friends will not read a story about a vindictive sister." I continued my gaze, sweeping over my mother-terrified expression. "They will read a highly detailed, publicly accessible court transcript outlining exactly how William and Victoria stole $200,000 from their own unborn grandchildren to pay for floral arrangements because they were too broke to finance their own daughter wedding." The silence that followed was absolute. The aggressive bullying facade my father had maintained for decades completely pulverized into dust. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly incapable of formulating a response. He realized with crushing certainty that any attempt to publicly retaliate would instantly trigger his own catastrophic criminal exposure. He was completely trapped. I looked at Harper, who was still sitting on the floor, weeping quietly into her hands. I looked at Victoria, trembling with the horrifying realization of her impending social annihilation. And finally, I looked at William, a broken, powerless man stripped of his unearned authority. I felt no thrill of victory. I did not experience the euphoric rush of a cinematic scorched earth revenge. The desire to see them hauled away in handcuffs, screaming and fighting against a team of federal agents simply did not exist. Vengeance is a loud, messy emotion born of deep insecurity. I was no longer insecure. I did not need to destroy them to prove my worth. Their own actions had already condemned them. The loss of the $200,000 trust fund was a devastating financial blow, but the true punishment was the reality they now had to face every time they looked in the mirror. They had to live with the undeniable truth that they had sacrificed their integrity, their relationship with me, and their moral compass for an illusion that had just shattered into a million pieces. I stepped out from behind the heavy mahogany desk. I did not summon the security guards to aggressively drag them out of the office. I did not demand a humiliating, highly publicized spectacle for the cameras. I simply walked over to the heavy oak doors and pulled them open. The grand sunlit hallway of the mountain estate stretched out before me, quiet and beautifully serene. "You can go now," I said softly, standing by the open doorway. William stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a mixture of profound hatred and absolute defeat. He did not say a single word. He simply turned on his heel, grabbed Victoria by the arm, and marched stiffly out of the executive office. He walked down the corridor, his heavy footsteps echoing against the marble, a man fleeing the scene of his own profound failure. Harper slowly pushed herself up from the Persian rug. She gathered the lapels of her designer trench coat, her movements sluggish and devoid of her usual frantic energy. She walked toward the door, keeping her head bowed, actively avoiding eye contact. She stepped over the threshold, disappearing into the hallway, leaving the oppressive weight of her lifelong insecurity behind her. I stood in the doorway, watching them retreat. They walked past the sprawling, expensive floral arrangements they had stolen money to purchase. They walked out the heavy front doors, stepping out into the crisp mountain air, entirely stripped of the venue, the groom, and the glittering future they had desperately tried to steal. I did not close the door behind them immediately. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool, clean air fill my lungs. The suffocating anxiety, the constant exhausting need to monitor their moods and anticipate their attacks had vanished entirely. The restraint I had shown was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate manifestation of absolute power. I had shed the lie that defined my childhood. I no longer needed to vanish to be safe. I could stand fully present, entirely visible, and remain completely untouchable. Carter stepped out from the shadows of the executive office, moving with his usual quiet grace. He stopped beside me in the open doorway, his presence a solid, grounding anchor. He did not offer a booming congratulations or a patronizing pat on the back. He simply looked at me, his dark eyes shining with immense, profound respect. "It is done," Carter murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. I nodded, letting a soft, genuine smile touch my lips. The battle was over. The toxic elements had been excised from the property, leaving behind a blank, pristine canvas. "Yes, it is," I replied, turning away from the empty hallway. "And we have a wedding to prepare for." The emotional debris of my family departure lingered for only a moment before the practical realities of the day demanded my attention. The sprawling mountain estate was entirely mine, and it was currently sitting in a state of suspended animation. The non-refundable staging, the massive floral installations, and the cinematic lighting rigs Harper had commissioned were fully assembled, waiting for a bride who was currently driving back to Charlotte in absolute disgrace. I walked back into the executive office, feeling a surge of productive corporate energy replace the heavy grief. It was time to reclaim the space, not through theft or exploitation, but through clean, legitimate authority. I picked up the desk phone and dialed the direct line for the regional operations manager of my hospitality holding company. He answered on the first ring. "The unauthorized occupants have officially vacated the premises," I instructed, my voice crisp and authoritative. "Please inform the security team to maintain a strict perimeter. No guests associated with the previous reservation are to be admitted under any circumstances." I paused, calculating my next move. The original plan I had discussed with Carter was to simply let Harper extravagant stolen setup go to waste, a stark visual representation of her failure. But as I looked out the window at the breathtaking glass conservatory gleaming in the morning sun, a different strategy crystallized in my mind. I did not want to discard the beauty of the venue. I wanted to utilize it, but I refused to exploit the labor of the vendors who had been unknowingly dragged into my family fraudulent scheme. "Contact every single vendor currently on site," I commanded, my tone unwavering. "The caterers, the florists, the lighting technicians, and the string quartet. Inform them that the previous contract is entirely void due to commercial fraud. However, Blue Ridge Hospitality Trust will assume immediate full financial responsibility for their services today. We will execute clean, legitimate contracts with each of them right now, and they will be compensated fairly for their time and materials." I hung up the phone feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. I was not reallocating stolen resources. I was establishing a new, honest foundation. The spectacular staging Harper had commissioned would remain, but it would be paid for cleanly, legitimately, and entirely on my own terms. The mountain estate, originally purchased as a quiet hiding place, was finally ready to serve its true purpose. It was no longer a fortress to keep the world out. It was a sanctuary designed to celebrate the people I actively chose to let in. The sprawling master suite of the Cascade Glass Conservatory estate was flooded with brilliant, unfiltered sunlight. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had saturated the property all morning was entirely gone, replaced by a light, effervescent energy. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the quiet hum of genuine affection. There were no frantic makeup artists barking orders for a social media live stream. There were no manipulative parents hovering in the background, offering backhanded compliments designed to chip away at my confidence. The toxic noise had been permanently silenced. Instead, the room was filled with the people I actively chose. My 3 closest friends, women I had known since my grueling early days as a junior financial analyst, moved around me with calm, practiced efficiency. They had kept my secret for months, silently watching the psychological warfare my family waged, and they had stood by my side, unwavering and fiercely loyal. Carter Mother, a retired judge with a sharp, discerning mind and a remarkably warm heart, sat on a plush velvet sofa near the bay window. She was sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea, watching me with an expression of profound maternal pride. She knew the entire scope of the morning events. Carter had briefed his family on the eviction, ensuring there were no whispered questions or awkward tensions regarding the sudden absence of the bride's biological relatives. The contrast between Carter family and my own was staggering. His parents traded in authenticity and mutual respect. They did not view children as investments or props for country club networking. They viewed us as equals. When Carter told them about the stolen venue and the restricted trust fund, they had not offered useless platitudes about family loyalty. They had offered their immediate, uncompromising support. I turned toward the full-length gilded mirror resting against the far wall. I was wearing my custom ivory silk wedding gown. It was not a flashy, sequined costume designed to maximize engagement on a lifestyle blog. It was a masterpiece of structural tailoring, elegant, understated, and incredibly powerful. The heavy silk draped perfectly over my frame, the fabric catching the mountain light. I looked at my reflection. The terrified, compliant daughter who had sat in a dark kitchen just a few nights ago, weeping over a drained bank account, was completely unrecognizable. The woman staring back at me was grounded, secure, and entirely at peace. My phone vibrated softly on the marble vanity. I picked it up, expecting a message from the property manager regarding the vendor contracts. Instead, the screen displayed a notification from my private equity firm, senior founding partner Richard. Richard was a 60-year-old titan of the Charlotte financial district, a man who had built his empire on ruthless acquisitions and flawless ethical standards. He was not a father figure, he was a mentor. He was the one who had recognized my analytical brilliance when I was just a mid-level risk analyst, plucking me from obscurity and aggressively championing my ascent to senior partner. He demanded excellence, but he rewarded loyalty. I tapped the screen, opening his message. The text was brief, carrying his signature no-nonsense efficiency. "I am in the lobby, Emma. The legal team back at the office sends their regards. I understand we have an opening in the processional lineup. I would be honored to fill it." A genuine, radiant smile broke across my face. I had not asked Richard to step in. I had fully prepared to walk down the aisle alone, viewing the solitary march as a symbol of my hard-won independence. But Richard's offer was not an act of pity. It was an acknowledgement of my professional standing and a testament to the chosen family I had cultivated outside the toxic bubble of my childhood home. I typed a quick, grateful confirmation. As I set the phone down, a sharp knock echoed from the heavy mahogany doors of the suite. Marcus, the venue coordinator, stepped tentatively into the room. He no longer looked like a terrified man facing a corporate execution. He looked incredibly relieved, carrying a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents on a silver tray. "Ms. Johnson," Marcus said, his voice steady and profoundly respectful. The transition protocols you requested have been successfully executed. I have personally spoken with the head chef, the lead floral designer, and the audiovisual staging director. I turned away from the mirror, giving him my full attention, and I asked, maintaining a professional cadence. They were initially quite alarmed by the sudden eviction of the previous party, Marcus admitted, adjusting his grip on the silver tray. However, when I presented the new immediate payment contracts authorized directly by Blue Ridge Hospitality Trust, their concerns evaporated entirely. He stepped forward, offering the tray. You are fully assuming the financial liability for the custom orchids, the cinematic lighting rigs, and the upgraded catering menu. The vendors are thrilled. They do not have to absorb a massive cancellation loss, and they are extremely eager to service your event today. The paperwork just requires your signature. I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen resting on the tray and signed my name with swift, decisive strokes. I did not experience a single twinge of guilt. I was not exploiting a legal loophole to seize Harper's stolen upgrades for free. I was paying for every single white orchid and every specialized lighting fixture cleanly, legitimately, and entirely out of my own corporate portfolio. The distinction was absolutely critical. Harper had attempted to build her dream wedding by committing federal wire fraud and trespassing on a property she did not own. She wanted the aesthetic without bearing the financial or moral cost. I was claiming the aesthetic by executing honest, transparent commercial contracts. I was winning by being fundamentally better, not by utilizing her corrupt tactics. Excellent work, Marcus, I said, handing the signed documents back to him. Please ensure the string quartet is prepared for the processional. We will begin in exactly 20 minutes. Marcus offered a deep, formal bow and exited the suite. The logistical machinery of the estate was operating flawlessly, fueled by clean capital and clear directives. The chaotic, hysterical energy my family had brought to the property was completely erased, replaced by the smooth, predictable rhythm of a perfectly managed corporate asset. My bridesmaids helped me secure my veil, adjusting the delicate tulle so it draped perfectly over my shoulders. We gathered our bouquets, laughing softly, as we walked out of the suite and navigated the grand marble corridors of the main lodge. The transition from the administrative wing to the primary event space was seamless. We approached the heavy carved oak doors leading out to the glass conservatory. Standing just outside the entrance, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored tuxedo, was Richard. My mentor looked at me, his sharp analytical eyes softening slightly, as he took in the ivory silk gown and the absolute clarity radiating from my posture. He did not offer empty platitudes or emotional speeches. He operated in the currency of respect. You handled the acquisition beautifully this morning, Emma, Richard stated, offering his arm with a formal, gentlemanly grace. I reviewed the eviction protocols on the drive up. Flawless execution, no legal exposure. You protected the firm asset perfectly. I slipped my hand through his arm, resting my fingers against the crisp, expensive fabric of his tuxedo sleeve. Thank you, Richard, I replied, a profound sense of grounding safety washing over me. I simply eliminated an unnecessary liability. He chuckled a low, rumbling sound. Indeed. Now let us finalize this merger. The heavy oak doors swung open. The visual impact of the cascade glass conservatory was breathtaking. The soaring, transparent walls offered an unobstructed 360-degree panoramic view of the Appalachian Mountains. The afternoon sun filtered through the glass, casting a warm, golden glow over the imported white orchids Harper had so desperately demanded. The cinematic lighting rigs, now cleanly paid for by my holding company, illuminated the space with a soft, ethereal brilliance. The room was absolutely packed. 200 guests, a meticulously curated list of corporate colleagues, loyal friends, and Carter's expansive, loving family rose to their feet in unison. There were no flying monkeys here. There were no gossiping aunts or judgmental cousins waiting to report my behavior back to Victoria. Every single person in the room traded in authentic respect, not toxic manipulation. The string quartet, positioned near the front of the conservatory, began playing a rich, soaring melody. The music swelled, filling the cavernous glass-walled space, completely drowning out any lingering echoes of the morning frantic eviction. I took my first step down the pristine white aisle runner. I did not rush. I did not scan the back rows searching for the faces of the family who had abandoned me. I kept my chin perfectly level, my posture rigid and undeniably powerful. I felt Richard's steady presence beside me, a physical manifestation of the professional empire I had built from nothing. I walked past rows of smiling, supportive faces. I saw the senior partners from Carter Law Firm nodding in approval. I saw my brilliant, dedicated risk analysis team beaming with genuine joy. I was not the forgotten invisible sister walking down an aisle out of mere obligation. I was the managing partner of Blue Ridge Hospitality Trust, walking through a sanctuary I had purchased with my own sheer brilliance, surrounded by an audience I had actively chosen. At the end of the long aisle, standing beneath an archway, woven with thousands of white roses, was Carter. The high-powered corporate litigator, a man who routinely destroyed fraudulent executives before lunch, looked at me with an expression of profound, unfiltered devotion. His dark eyes shone with a fierce, protective pride. He had watched me navigate the brutal psychological warfare of the past 72 hours. He had seen the terror, the grief, and the ultimate freezing resolve. He knew exactly what it cost me to stand in this room today, and he respected the absolute hell out of the woman who survived it. We reached the altar. Richard turned to me, offering a final respectful nod before stepping back into the front row. I stepped forward, placing my hands directly into Carter, awaiting palms. His grip was firm, anchoring me entirely to the present moment. The cool mountain air drifted through the open vents of the conservatory, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh rain. The officiant, a close friend of Carter family, smiled warmly and began the ceremony. Her voice resonated clearly across the opulent space, speaking of trust, resilience, and the undeniable power of a partnership built on absolute equality. The ceremony flowed flawlessly, a beautiful, sacred event completely untainted by the frantic, silent panic that was currently tearing my biological family apart somewhere on the highway back to Charlotte. I stood at the altar surrounded by luxury, deeply in love, and entirely, permanently free. As the officiant spoke about the foundation of a strong marriage, my mind briefly registered the sheer magnitude of the victory. I had not just reclaimed a stolen venue. I had not simply outsmarted a greedy sister. I had fundamentally rewritten the entire architecture of my existence. It was time for our vows. The moment required a vulnerability. I had spent my entire life trying to suppress a truth that could not be hidden behind corporate maneuvering or legal strategy. I looked into Carter's eyes, ready to speak the reality aloud. The acoustic resonance of the glass conservatory amplified the quiet, expectant hush of the 200 guests. The Appalachian String Quartet ceased playing, letting the natural silence of the mountain valley seep through the transparent walls. I stood facing Carter, my hands resting lightly in his. His palms were warm, a stark, comforting contrast to the icy, calculated adrenaline that had sustained me for the past 72 hours. The officiant offered a gentle nod, indicating it was my turn to speak. I took a slow, deep breath, drawing the crisp, pine-scented air into my lungs. For 34 years, my words had been carefully measured, heavily filtered through an internal algorithm designed to minimize conflict and appease egos. I had mastered the art of speaking without actually saying anything that could be weaponized against me. Today, that algorithm was permanently disabled. Carter, I began, my voice clear and steady, echoing softly against the glass panes. I spent the vast majority of my life operating under a very specific, deeply ingrained misunderstanding. I believed that love was a transaction. I thought it required a constant, exhausting calculation of how much space I was allowed to occupy without causing offense. I convinced myself that the only way to earn affection, the only way to guarantee my own safety, was to make myself entirely invisible. I thought if I simply wanted nothing, if I asked for nothing, I would finally be enough. I paused, looking down at our intertwined hands. The heavy protective silence of our chosen audience held the space, allowing the raw honesty of the admission to settle. I did not need to explicitly name my parents or my sister. The people sitting in the front rows, the mentors and the loyal friends who had watched me navigate the brutal psychological warfare of my family, understood the precise weight of the confession. But hiding in the shadows is not a life I continued, lifting my gaze to meet his dark, unwavering eyes. It is just a very quiet way to die. You were the first person who ever looked at my silence and refused to accept it as a virtue. You did not demand that I shrink to accommodate your ambition. You did not ask me to soften my edges or apologize for my intellect. You looked at the woman who built fortresses in the dark, and you simply told her to turn on the lights. A faint, incredibly tender smile touched the corners of Carter's mouth. The formidable corporate litigator, the man who routinely eviscerated hostile witnesses with clinical detachment, stood before me with absolute, unfiltered vulnerability. You taught me that true partnership does not require subtraction. I said the words flowing with a newfound, unshakable conviction. It requires an absolute multiplier. You taught me that being fiercely independent does not mean I have to fight every battle alone. Today, I promise to stop disappearing. I promise to stand fully present in this life we are building. I promise to fiercely protect our joy, our boundaries, and our future, with the exact same ruthless dedication I use to protect my career. And I promise to always unconditionally let myself be seen by you. I slipped the heavy platinum band onto his finger, the cool metal sealing the vow. Carter did not immediately launch into his own prepared statement. He simply looked at me for a long, profound moment, his dark eyes shining with a fierce, protective pride. When he finally spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant rumble that carried a staggering emotional gravity. "Emma." He started his grip, tightening slightly around my fingers. "When I first met you in that chaotic merger negotiation 5 years ago, I saw a woman who possessed an absolutely terrifying brilliance. You dismantled a room full of arrogant senior partners without raising your voice above a whisper. You were a titan. But outside the boardroom, I watched you systematically dismantle yourself just to make other people comfortable." He glanced briefly toward the empty chairs in the very back row, the seats my biological family would have occupied if they had not chosen theft over loyalty. He did not sneer or project a malicious triumph. He simply acknowledged the void with a quiet, somber respect for the grief it represented. "I watched you carry the weight of impossible expectations." Carter continued, returning his unwavering focus to me. "I watched you absorb collateral damage that you never deserved. I made a vow to myself a very long time ago that I would never orchestrate your battles for you, because you are perfectly capable of destroying any obstacle in your path. My job was never to save you. My job was simply to refuse to let you shrink." He lifted my hand, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. "I promise to be the anchor when the market is volatile." Carter vowed, his tone dropping into a cadence of absolute, unbreakable certainty. "I promise to be the sounding board for your most aggressive strategies. I promise that in this marriage, you will never have to edit your ambition, apologize for your success, or minimize your presence. I promise to stand beside you entirely visible as an equal partner in everything we build." He slid the diamond band onto my finger, the stones catching the golden afternoon sunlight filtering through the conservatory roof. The officiant smiled radiantly, formally, pronouncing us husband and wife. The grand glass-walled room erupted into genuine, thunderous applause. There were no polite, obligatory claps. The sound was a roaring wave of authentic celebration from a community that traded in mutual respect, not leverage. The reception that followed was a magnificent, flawless triumph of logistical execution and genuine joy. We bypassed the stifling performative traditions of country club weddings. There were no tense, forced family dances. There were no long, agonizing speeches filled with backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive jabs. Instead, the evening flowed with an easy, effervescent grace. The $150,000 worth of luxury upgrades Harper had foolishly commissioned transformed the mountain estate into an absolute masterpiece. The imported white orchids gleamed under the cinematic lighting rigs, creating an immersive, ethereal atmosphere. We dined on an exquisite multi-course menu crafted by the local chef, the flavors bold and authentically Southern, completely devoid of pretension. I moved through the crowd, my ivory silk gown gliding effortlessly over the polished hardwood floors. I did not have to constantly scan the room anxiously, monitoring the mood of an erratic sister, or appeasing the fragile ego of a demanding mother. The hypervigilant radar I had operated on for 34 years was completely powered down. I laughed loudly, drank vintage champagne with my private equity team, and danced until my feet ached. As the evening progressed, the absence of my biological family was quietly acknowledged not as a victorious conquest, but as a necessary, sorrowful amputation. The empty chairs at the periphery of the room were a stark reminder of the cost of drawing an absolute boundary. During the toasts, my mentor Richard stood up and tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The room quieted down, turning their attention to the senior partner. He did not mention the morning dramatic eviction. He did not gloat about the corporate execution. He spoke purely of character. He spoke about my relentless work ethic, my capacity to absorb massive pressure without fracturing, and the fierce, unyielding loyalty I showed to my team. He raised his glass, offering a toast, not to a victorious corporate raider, but to a woman who had finally stepped fully into her own power. Carter followed with his own toast. He stood beside me, his arm wrapped securely around my waist. He looked out over the crowd of friends and colleagues, his expression a mixture of deep gratitude and sharp litigator intellect. There is a distinct difference between surviving a storm and actually learning how to control the weather, Carter said, his voice echoing clearly across the opulent room. Today I watched my wife completely master the climate. But she did not do it with malice. She did it with the kind of terrifying absolute integrity that most people spend their entire lives pretending to possess. To Emma, the strongest, most brilliant woman I have ever known. The guests raised their glasses, the chorus of cheers ringing out into the cool mountain night. I leaned into Carter, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of his presence. The victory ached. The grief for the family I never truly had lingered beneath the joy, a quiet, persistent shadow. But the pain was clean. It was the sterile sting of a necessary surgical incision, entirely preferable to the suffocating rot of the infection I had finally excised. We partied late into the night, the music pulsing through the floorboards, completely untouched by the absolute chaos and devastation currently tearing my parents' lives apart just a few hours away down the mountain. The estate I had quietly bought, originally intended as a hiding place from their relentless demands, had finally served its true purpose. It was a sanctuary. However, the consequences of the morning eviction were not contained to the borders of the Blue Ridge property. The digital trap Carter and I had constructed was a sophisticated, multi-layered mechanism. The venue cancellation was merely the initial physical shockwave. The true catastrophic detonation was currently echoing through the highest echelons of the Charlotte social and financial districts. The arrogant illusion my family had spent decades meticulously building was about to be entirely pulverized by the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The return to Charlotte on Monday morning did not feature a dramatic cinematic parade through the financial district. There were no press conferences, no explosive confrontations in country club dining rooms, and no triumphant monologues delivered over speakerphone. The transition back to reality was quiet, methodical, and governed by the sterile, uncompromising rhythm of the corporate work week. Carter drove us back to our apartment. I unpacked my suitcase, placed the leftover wedding programs in a desk drawer, and logged onto my secure server by 8:30. The private equity firm required my immediate attention regarding a looming fourth-quarter acquisition, and the market does not pause to accommodate family trauma. The heavy machinery of my professional life seamlessly re-engaged, providing a necessary rigid structure that anchored my racing mind. The fallout from the mountain estate, however, could not be entirely compartmentalized. The social ecosystem of affluent Charlotte is a tightly woven, highly communicative web. Secrets are the primary currency, and a scandal of this magnitude was simply too lucrative to remain hidden. I did not orchestrate a public relations campaign. I did not hire a firm to leak the details of the eviction to the local society blogs. I simply maintained my absolute disciplined silence. The truth, as it often does when dealing with staggering incompetence, managed to leak entirely on its own. The initial breach occurred through the vendors, a luxury staging crew irritated by the sudden shift in contracts, despite my swift, clean compensation, gossiped to an event planner at a rival firm. The event planner mentioned the chaotic morning eviction to a client who happened to sit on the board of the country club my mother prized above all else. Within 48 hours, the narrative of the hijacked venue and Preston cowardly desertion was common knowledge among Victoria peer group. Harper, completely desperate to salvage her rapidly disintegrating influencer brand, made the catastrophic error of attempting to control the spin. On Tuesday afternoon, she posted a lengthy, tearful video to her social media channels. She sat on the edge of her pristine white bed wearing an oversized sweater, completely devoid of makeup. She played the fragile victim flawlessly, claiming that a sudden, severe medical emergency within the family had forced the heartbreaking postponement of her dream wedding. She spun a tragic tale of sacrificing her special day to care for a hospitalized relative. It was a brilliant, highly manipulative performance, entirely ruined by the fact that several of her 200 invited guests had already posted videos of the Saturday morning chaos. The guests, furious at having booked expensive hotel rooms and traveled to Asheville only to be turned away by security guards, had uploaded shaky smartphone footage to their own accounts. The videos clearly showed Harper dressed in her bridal robe screaming hysterically at the estate manager while being escorted off the gravel driveway. The digital contradiction was glaring, immediate, and entirely unassailable. Harper comment section, usually filled with vapid praise and heart emojis, instantly transformed into a brutal, unyielding tribunal. Her followers demanded an explanation for the conflicting footage. The few legitimate brand sponsorships she had managed to secure quietly terminated their contracts, citing violations of their morality clauses. Brands built on the illusion of effortless luxury evaporate quickly when exposed to the harsh, messy reality of public eviction and financial instability. I watched her influencer career fizzle out from the quiet safety of my office. I did not feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I did not experience the dark, satisfying thrill of a perfectly executed revenge. Watching Harper desperately delete negative comments and eventually deactivate her profiles altogether felt hollow. It was like watching a poorly constructed building collapse under its own weight. The destruction was inevitable, born of a foundation that never actually existed. Her empire was a facade, and the collapse was simply gravity taking its natural course. The familial fallout was equally muted and deeply polarizing. The Johnson extended family network fractured along predictable fault lines. On Wednesday evening, my phone began to vibrate incessantly. The family group chat, a digital space I had largely ignored for years, suddenly erupted with frantic activity. My father, older brother, a retired real estate developer who shared William Arrogant worldview, sent a massive, scathing paragraph. He accused me of being a cold, calculating sociopath who had irreparably damaged the family reputation simply to prove a petty point. He demanded I publicly apologize and issue a statement clearing my parents' names. Several other distant relatives, people who only appeared at holiday dinners to drink expensive wine and complain about the economy, quickly chimed in echoing his sentiments. They did not care about the stolen trust fund or the hijacked venue. They only cared about the discomfort the scandal was causing them at their local golf courses. But the condemnation was not absolute. A few hours later, a private direct message appeared on my screen from Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. Carol had always been the quiet observer of the family, a retired school teacher who largely avoided the competitive toxicity of Victoria orbit. Emma, her message, read the text, stark and simple. I heard what happened. I am so incredibly sorry. I always knew they treated you poorly, but I never realized the extent of their cruelty. I am ashamed I never said anything. I am proud of you for standing your ground. I stared at Carol's message for a long time. The validation was a tiny, unexpected balm applied to a very old wound. It confirmed that my reality was not a delusion. I was not the crazy, difficult daughter they had spent decades trying to convince me I was. I did not reply to Aunt Carol. I did not engage with the furious accusations in the main group chat. I did not offer explanations, defend my actions, or attempt to sway the opinions of people who were fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. I opened the settings on my smartphone. I tapped the red button to leave the family group chat. A small confirmation window appeared, warning me that I would no longer receive messages from this conversation. I pressed confirm. I then proceeded to individually block the phone numbers of my parents, my sister, and the specific relatives who had hurled insults. I executed the digital purge with the same calm, clinical efficiency I applied to balancing a corporate ledger. It was not an act of rage. It was an act of profound, necessary peace. I was permanently closing a door that should have been locked years ago. I did not take revenge. I simply reclaimed my absolute freedom. Carter walked into my home office leaning against the doorframe, watching me set the phone down on the desk. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew the difference between the frantic energy of a crisis and the quiet exhaustion of a concluded battle. "It is quiet." Carter observed a slight knowing smile touching his lips. "Yes," I replied, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and looking out the window at the Charlotte skyline. "It is finally quiet. The immediate social skirmishes were over. The flying monkeys had been silenced, the influencer career had imploded, and the country club gossip was slowly burning itself out. But the quiet in my office did not reflect the catastrophic storm currently gathering directly over my parents' heads. The social annihilation was merely the superficial consequence of their arrogant choices. The true terrifying penalty for their actions was entirely out of my hands, currently grinding through the relentless, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The digital dossier Carter had forwarded to the authorities was not a mere suggestion of impropriety. It was a fully documented, trial-ready roadmap of severe financial crimes. The federal government, unlike the Charlotte elite, did not care about public relations or country club appearances. They cared about the illegal transfer of restricted funds across state lines. The consequences of my parents' grand larceny were about to arrive, not with a passive-aggressive text message, but with a federal warrant. The aggressive, humid heat of the North Carolina summer finally broke, surrendering to the crisp, golden chill of late October. 7 months had passed since the morning I stood in the executive office of the Blue Ridge Mountain Estate and handed my family their eviction notice. The passage of time had accomplished what raw anger never could. It had entirely metabolized the residual chaos of my childhood, transforming the sharp, frantic pain of betrayal into a dull, manageable ache. I sat at my expansive mahogany desk in the corner office of my private equity firm, the Charlotte skyline sprawling out beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The chaotic, hysterical energy that had once defined my interactions with my family was completely absent from my daily life. In its place was a rigid, highly productive corporate routine. I directed acquisitions, negotiated massive regional mergers, and maintained the cold, analytical focus that made me a formidable senior partner. But today, the financial documents spread across my desk did not relate to a hostile corporate takeover or a high-yield real estate portfolio. The heavy, cream-colored legal folder resting beneath my fingertips contained the finalized paperwork for a brand-new, highly secured banking entity. I had spent the morning working with my personal wealth manager, a discreet, incredibly sharp woman who specialized in generational asset protection. I opened the folder, my eyes tracing the stark, black ink printed across the top page. The document established the Johnson Family Legacy Trust. I picked up my titanium pen, removing the cap with a smooth, decisive motion. I did not experience the tight, suffocating knot of anxiety that had accompanied the creation of the original trust fund 2 years ago. When I funded the first account, it was a desperate, agonizing test of my parents' basic morality. I had offered them $200,000 and a fragile moral boundary, praying they would choose my future over my sister vanity. They had failed spectacularly, draining the account to fund their golden child's stolen wedding. This new trust was fundamentally different. I signed my name on the bottom line, the ink flowing effortlessly onto the page. I was actively authorizing the immediate transfer of $500,000 from my private, unencumbered liquid capital directly into this new, heavily fortified account. This money was not a test. It was not a trap designed to expose their greed, and it was certainly not a slush fund accessible to anyone sharing my maiden name. I had structured the Johnson Family Legacy Trust with absolute impenetrable legal safeguards. My parents were completely excluded from the authorization roster. Harper's name was nowhere near the documentation. The trust was managed by an independent third-party fiduciary entirely walled off from the toxic financial ecosystem of my biological family. I set the pen down, feeling a profound, quiet sense of restoration. I was reclaiming the space they had violated. I was rebuilding the foundation for my future children, ensuring that the wealth I generated through grueling 80-hour work weeks would genuinely serve its intended purpose. I was securing the legacy they had so casually attempted to destroy. A soft knock interrupted the serene quiet of my office. My executive assistant, a highly efficient young man who managed my schedule with military precision, opened the heavy oak door. He did not step fully into the room, hovering respectfully near the threshold. "Excuse me, Emma," he said, his tone carrying a note of careful hesitation. "The mailroom just sent up the afternoon delivery. There is a personal correspondence included in the stack. It was flagged during the standard security screening because the return address matches the parameters you established for restricted contacts. I did not flinch. I did not feel the sudden icy spike of adrenaline that used to accompany any communication from my family. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, maintaining my composed professional demeanor. "Bring it in," I instructed calmly. He walked across the plush carpet, placed a small stack of corporate magazines and manila envelopes on the corner of my desk, and quietly exited the room, pulling the door shut behind him. Sitting squarely on top of the stack was a single pale blue envelope. The handwriting sweeping across the front was elegant, familiar, and entirely unmistakable. It belonged to Victoria. I stared at the envelope for several long minutes. The heavy silence of the office amplified the significance of the physical object resting on my desk. Since the morning of the eviction, I had maintained an absolute, unyielding digital blockade. I had blocked their phone numbers, restricted their emails, and severed all social media connections. I had vanished from their daily reality, transforming myself into an untouchable corporate ghost. Victoria had resorted to the only method of communication that could not be instantly deleted by a spam filter. She had utilized the United States Postal Service, mailing a physical letter directly to the heavily guarded fortress of my private equity firm. I reached out my fingers, brushing against the heavy, textured paper. The urge to simply sweep the envelope into the shredder bin beneath my desk was powerful. It would have been the easiest, cleanest resolution. A total, scorched earth estrangement, the final definitive closing of the door. But I am not a woman who operates on blind reactive emotion. I deal in calculated data. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced the envelope open with a swift, clean motion. I extracted a single handwritten page. I unfolded it, bracing myself for the inevitable barrage of toxic manipulation. I fully expected a lengthy theatrical monologue detailing how my cruelty had ruined their lives. I anticipated a masterful display of victimhood, blaming Carter legal maneuvers or Harper influencer ambitions for the massive federal investigation currently dismantling my father business. I began to read. The first sentence immediately shattered my expectations. It was not an aggressive attack. It was not a dramatic weeping plea for a financial bailout to cover William mounting legal defense fees. The letter was remarkably brief, completely devoid of Victoria's usual sprawling dramatic flair. "Emma," the letter began, the ink slightly uneven, suggesting a hand that was not entirely steady. "The federal auditors finalized their review of your father business accounts this morning. The reality of our situation is absolute, and the consequences are entirely our own. We lost the house on Myers Park yesterday. We are packing what remains." I paused, absorbing the stark, unvarnished reality of her words. The federal trap Carter had initiated months ago had finally definitively snapped shut. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had uncovered the massive illegal wire transfers and the severe misappropriation of trust fund assets. The arrogant old money facade was entirely pulverized. They were bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and facing the very real threat of federal incarceration. I continued reading, my eyes scanning the final heavy paragraph. "I am not writing this to ask for your help," Victoria wrote. "I know that bridge is permanently burned, and I know exactly who handed you the matches. For 34 years, I chose the easiest path. I chose the daughter who demanded my attention, and I completely abandoned the daughter who actually deserved my respect. I thought your silence meant you were strong enough to carry the weight of our failures. I was wrong. We took from you because we were weak, not because you were less." The letter ended abruptly. There was no desperate plea for a reunion. There was no demand for an in-person meeting to discuss forgiveness. It was simply signed with her name. I slowly lowered the pale blue paper to the surface of my desk. I stared at the elegant, uneven handwriting until the letters blurred into meaningless shapes. It was not a complete groveling apology. It did not magically erase the decades of emotional neglect, the gaslighting, or the theft of the original $200,000 trust fund. The letter did not repair the fundamental broken architecture of our relationship, but it was an admission. It was the very first time in my entire existence that Victoria had explicitly acknowledged her own failure without immediately shifting the blame onto my supposed jealousy or my difficult personality. She had looked at the total destruction of her privileged life, the loss of her mansion, and the impending federal charges, and she had finally admitted that the devastation was entirely self-inflicted. A complex, heavy wave of emotion washed over me. The old Emma, the girl desperate for any crumb of parental validation, would have wept over this letter. She would have immediately picked up the phone, driven to the crumbling remnants of the Myers Park estate, and offered a lifeline. She would have sacrificed her own peace to ease their suffering. The woman sitting behind the mahogany desk did not reach for the phone. I did not experience a sudden, overwhelming urge to forgive them and welcome them back into my life. The betrayal was too deep, the financial and emotional theft too severe to be paved over by a single paragraph of handwritten remorse. But I also did not feel the cold, hardened need to completely obliterate their memory. The desire for absolute cartoonish vengeance had entirely burned out. I carefully folded the pale blue letter along its original creases. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, a secure locked compartment where I kept my most sensitive personal files. I placed the letter inside, laying it flat against the bottom, and pushed the drawer shut. The metallic click of the lock engaging echoed softly in the quiet office. I did not reply to the letter. I did not send a carefully worded corporate response acknowledging her admission. I maintained my silence, preserving the impenetrable boundary I had built around my life. But I did not destroy the letter either. I left the door fractionally cracked, not for a joyous cinematic family reunion next week or next month. The trust was broken, and the consequences of their federal crimes would require years to fully unfold. But perhaps someday in the distant future, when the dust of their financial ruin had completely settled and the toxicity had been entirely starved out of their system, a conversation might be possible. I did not need them. My life with Carter was brilliant, secure, and profoundly happy. My corporate empire was thriving, and the newly established Johnson Family Legacy Trust guaranteed that the next generation would be entirely protected from the greed of the past. I had reclaimed my space. I had drawn an absolute boundary, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, necessary commitment to my own survival. The ambiguity of the unanswered letter was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate manifestation of my maturity and my power. I controlled the access to my life, and I would determine the terms of engagement on my own timeline. The past was securely locked in a desk drawer, no longer dictating my present. I turned my chair back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling, vibrant city below. The storm had finally passed, and the horizon was absolutely clear. The morning mist clung to the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a soft silver haze that slowly dissolved under the rising autumn sun. Exactly 1 year had passed since the morning I stood on this same terrace, draped in heavy ivory silk, and issued the order that severed my ties to my biological family. The air today held the same crisp pine-scented chill, but the heavy, suffocating tension that used to reside in my chest had evaporated like the mountain fog. I leaned against the wrought iron railing wrapped in a thick, worn cardigan, holding a ceramic mug of dark coffee. The warmth seeped into my palms, a quiet, grounding sensation. I looked down at the valley below, where the Cascade Glass Conservatory caught the early morning light. The transparent walls reflected the vibrant orange and gold hues of the surrounding forest, blending the structure seamlessly into the natural landscape. A year ago, this estate was a tactical asset. It was a heavily obfuscated property shielded behind the dense legal framework of the Blue Ridge Hospitality Trust. I had purchased these 500 acres as a secret refuge, a hidden fortress where I could exert control from the shadows. I had used it to trap my sister and my parents in their own web of entitlement. But as I watched the sunlight dance across the glass panes today, the property no longer felt like a weapon or a corporate stronghold. It was simply our home. The heavy strategic armor I had worn for 34 years was no longer required. For my entire life, I had operated under a deeply flawed, self-destructive philosophy. I had genuinely believed that the only way to survive the chaotic, demanding orbit of my family was to make myself small. I thought that if I wanted nothing, if I occupied no space, and if I demanded no recognition, I would be safe from their cruelty. I surrendered my savings, my graduation dinners, and eventually my own wedding venue, functioning under the misguided premise that my invisibility was my greatest shield. Standing on the terrace, breathing in the clean mountain air, I realized how profoundly wrong I had been. Shrinking did not protect me. It only transformed me into a convenient, limitless resource for people who traded on my compliance. By constantly erasing my own boundaries to keep the peace I had inadvertently funded their delusion. I had taught them that my achievements, my income, and my joy were merely raw materials they could harvest whenever Harper required a new spotlight, or my parents needed to project an image of effortless Southern aristocracy. The popular narrative dictates that success is the best revenge. Society loves the cinematic image of the discarded underdog returning in a designer suit to crush their oppressors beneath the weight of their accumulated wealth. For a brief period sitting behind the mahogany desk in the executive office and handing my father that eviction notice, I thought I was fulfilling that exact trope. I thought the sheer scale of my private equity career was the ultimate retaliation. But as the months passed and the dust of the eviction settled, that narrative revealed itself to be hollow. Revenge implies an active, deliberate destruction of another human being. It requires malice, ongoing engagement, and a continuous expenditure of emotional energy. When I looked back at the events that led to my family legal and social ruin, I recognized the quiet, sobering truth. I never detonated anyone. I did not plant evidence, fabricate invoices, or orchestrate a complex frame job. My parents willfully chose to commit federal wire fraud. They made the conscious, arrogant decision to drain a restricted trust fund to pay for non-refundable event staging. Harper chose to trespass on a property she did not own, relying on a bribed coordinator to bypass legal contracts. They built a spectacular, fragile house of cards, and they positioned themselves directly underneath it. For decades, I had been the one silently holding up the supporting pillars, absorbing the strain to ensure their structure never collapsed. The only thing I did on the morning of my wedding was take a step back. I simply removed my hands from their crumbling foundation and allowed gravity to take its natural course. I stopped defending them from the consequences of their own character. The resulting fallout was not a triumph I celebrated with champagne. It was a somber, necessary realignment of the universe. The federal investigations proceeded without my active involvement. The IRS traced the stolen trust fund money, issuing the indictments that cost my parents their country club status, their heavily leveraged mansion, and their fabricated reputation. Harper influencer brand died, a quiet, unremarkable death, fading into obscurity the moment her endless supply of unearned capital dried up. I watched their empire dissolve from afar, feeling neither joy nor lingering anger. The predominant emotion was a profound, steady peace. I had reclaimed my life not by crushing them, but by finally giving myself permission to exist in the light. The heavy sliding glass door behind me scraped softly along its track. Carter stepped out onto the terrace carrying his own mug of coffee. He wore a simple gray sweater and faded denim, his dark hair slightly rumpled from sleep. He walked over and stood beside me, leaning his forearms against the cold iron railing. He did not ask what I was thinking about. He did not probe or attempt to manage my emotions. He simply offered his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in my new reality. I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of his breathing. Carter had never asked me to wage war against my family. He had never pressured me to leverage my corporate power for a petty victory. From the very beginning, the brilliant corporate litigator had only ever asked me for one thing. He asked me to stop disappearing. He saw the woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar buyouts, and he refused to let her shrink back into a frightened child the moment her mother walked into the room. He did not orchestrate my freedom. He provided the safe, steady environment that allowed me to finally orchestrate it myself. "It is a beautiful morning," Carter murmured, his gaze sweeping over the vibrant autumn foliage blanketing the valley. "It really is," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. The flavor was rich and grounded, devoid of the bitter anxiety that used to taint my quiet moments. We stood together on the terrace for a long time, watching the sun climb higher into the Carolina sky, illuminating the frost-covered pines and the pristine glass of the conservatory below. There were no urgent emails demanding my attention. There were no frantic, manipulative text messages waiting on my phone. The manufactured crises that used to dictate my schedule were gone, replaced by a quiet, deliberate life built on authenticity and mutual respect. I turned away from the railing, intertwining my fingers with Carter's free hand. We walked back inside, leaving the crisp mountain chill for the ambient warmth of our home. We passed through the main living area, where the sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors and illuminated the comfortable lived-in furniture. Our path took us down the wide, paneled hallway toward the kitchen. As we walked, we passed the heavy oak door of the executive office. It was the exact room where I had sat in my ivory suit, slid the depleted trust ledger across the mahogany desk, and delivered the eviction notice that severed my ties to my biological family. For months after the wedding, I had kept that office door firmly closed and locked. It had served its purpose as a tactical bunker, a fortified space where I dealt with the ugly, necessary logistics of commercial law and boundary enforcement. It was a symbol of the defensive posture I had been forced to adopt. I paused in the hallway, letting go of Carter's hand for a brief moment. I stepped up to the heavy oak door and reached for the brass handle. I did not turn the lock or pull the door shut. Instead, I pushed it inward, swinging it wide open until the hinges rested silently against the wall stopper. The morning sunlight flooded the room, washing over the mahogany desk and the towering bookshelves. It was no longer a cold, sterile corporate battlefield. It was just a quiet room with a beautiful view of the mountains, the ghosts of the past, the echoes of my father's furious threats, and my mother's desperate gaslighting had vanished entirely. The space held no lingering power over me. I left the door standing wide open, an invitation for the light to circulate freely through every corner of the house. I had spent a lifetime building fortresses and hiding behind locked doors, terrified that if I allowed myself to be truly seen, I would be consumed. I turned away from the open office and walked back to Carter, who was waiting for me with a soft, understanding smile. We continued down the sunlit hallway, together stepping out of the shadows and moving forward into the bright, undeniable clarity of a life fully lived.